You spent 12 years in a classroom. You took the notes. You passed the tests. You repeated the facts with confidence. Almost none of it was true. Let's go. 1. You've been told since childhood that Christopher Columbus bravely sailed west to prove the flat Earth crowd wrong, single-handedly rescuing humanity from medieval ignorance and delivering the revolutionary news that the planet beneath their feet was actually a sphere. This is a complete fabrication of the historical record, and it's a fabrication that somehow made it onto classroom walls in 47 countries. Educated Europeans had accepted a spherical Earth for nearly 2,000 years before Columbus was born. Greek mathematician Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy around 240 BC, using shadow angles and basic geometry, standing in the ancient world's equivalent of a community college, and still getting it right. The ancient Library of Alexandria actively taught spherical Earth theory as settled, unremarkable science. Columbus's actual dispute with Spanish scholars wasn't about the shape of the planet. It was about the size. And Columbus was the one who got it catastrophically wrong, underestimating the Earth's circumference so badly that he would have died at sea if an entire undiscovered continent hadn't been sitting exactly where his math needed dry land to be. The flat Earth medievalists' narrative was largely invented by 19th century novelist Washington Irving, who fictionalized Columbus's biography in 1828 to make it more dramatic. A novelist rewrote history. Schools adopted the novel. Here you are. 2. Somewhere between elementary school and adulthood, you absorbed the idea that you are sitting on a vast reserve of untapped mental potential, that only 10% of your brain is active at any given time, and that the remaining 90% is dormant, waiting to be unlocked by the right seminar, the right supplement, or the right motivational poster in a guidance counselor's office. This statistic is completely fabricated. It has no verified origin, no supporting study, and no mechanism that would make it biologically possible. Modern neuroimaging technology allows scientists to watch the living brain in real time, and there is no dormant 90% sitting idle, waiting for activation. Over a full day, essentially every region of your brain is used for something. Beyond the imaging evidence, there is an even simpler argument. Your brain consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy, despite representing only about 2% of your total mass. Evolution is ruthless about eliminating expensive organs that don't earn their keep. A brain that was 90% non-functional would have been selected out of existence millions of years ago. Damage to virtually any brain region from injury or stroke produces measurable, specific functional losses, which proves that every region is doing something important. The 10% myth has been falsely attributed to Albert Einstein for decades, which is probably the only reason anyone believed it with such confidence. Einstein didn't say it. Nobody credible said it. It just sounded profound enough that nobody checked. 3. Every geography class you ever sat in told you that the Great Wall of China is so enormous, so magnificently vast, that astronauts can see it from orbit with the naked eye. It is probably the most repeated fact in the history of geography education, delivered with the kind of certainty usually reserved for mathematics. No astronaut has ever reliably spotted the Great Wall from space with the naked eye. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei, the single most convenient test case imaginable for this claim, looked for it during his 2003 mission and confirmed he could not see it. The wall is extraordinarily long, certainly, but length is not what determines naked eye visibility from orbit. Width is. And the Great Wall is only 15 to 30 feet wide in most sections. From the International Space Station at roughly 250 miles up, the human eye can resolve objects no smaller than about 50 to 60 feet wide under ideal conditions. A standard paved highway is wider than most sections of the Great Wall, and highways are similarly invisible from space. The myth appeared in print as early as 1932, 3 full decades before any human being had ever been to space, meaning it was untestable and simply accepted as fact for an entire generation before anyone could contradict it. It is a great wall. It does not require a fabricated space story to be impressive. 4. The word Napoleonic complex exists in common usage. You almost certainly know it. And it exists because everyone knows Napoleon Bonaparte was a tiny, furious man who compensated for his physical insignificance by conquering most of Europe. Textbooks treat his short stature as settled biographical color, the kind of fun historical fact that makes dead leaders feel human. Napoleon was approximately 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall in modern measurement, which made him solidly average to slightly above average for a French man of his era. The confusion is a units problem. French inches, called pouces, were longer than English inches. When his recorded height of 5'2" in French units was read by British audiences in English inches, the number shrank significantly, and the mistranslation hardened into legend across the channel. British wartime propaganda did the rest. Political cartoonist James Gilray deliberately depicted Napoleon as tiny to mock and diminish him as a military enemy, and those caricatures were extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily widely distributed. His nickname among his own troops was Le Petit Caporal, meaning the little corporal, which was a term of genuine affection, not a reference to his physical stature. His personal guards were required to be tall men, which meant that virtually every documented observation of Napoleon placed him surrounded by very large soldiers, making him appear shorter than he was. A wartime smear campaign outlasted the actual war by 200 years and got printed in children's textbooks. That is a more impressive conquest than anything he did militarily. 5. In 3rd grade, you drew a diagram. 5 boxes. 5 labels. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. You memorized it. You were tested on it. You passed. The diagram was wrong. Humans have somewhere between 9 and 21 distinct senses, depending on how you define the term. And neuroscientists have been broadly in agreement on this point for decades. The 5-sense framework was proposed by Aristotle around 350 BC as a philosophical categorization of human experience. It was never a biological claim. It was a starting point for philosophy, not a conclusion from anatomy, and it migrated intact into science classrooms for the next 2,300 years without anyone updating it. Proprioception, your sense of where your own body parts are in space without looking at them, is entirely distinct from touch and is the reason you can walk down a hallway without watching your feet. Vestibular sense is your sense of balance and spatial orientation, processed in your inner ear, and is demonstrably separate from hearing. Thermoception is your ability to sense temperature. Nociception is your distinct sense of pain. None of these are simply touch. They are different systems with different receptors, different neural pathways, and different processing centers. Aristotle built a philosophical framework before anyone understood how nerves worked. Using that framework as the definitive scientific count in a modern biology class is roughly equivalent to using his medical advice for treating illness and wondering why the patient isn't improving. 6. You've heard this one as both a science fact and a life philosophy. Lightning is random, chaotic, and statistically unlikely to strike the same place twice. Comfort yourself with that. Move on. Do not worry about the spot where lightning just struck. Here is the physics. Lightning absolutely, demonstrably, and repeatedly strikes the same places, and it does so constantly. The Empire State Building is struck by lightning an average of 20 to 25 times per year. It has been hit multiple times during a single thunderstorm. Lightning follows the path of least electrical resistance to the ground. If a tall conductive structure created a great path to ground once, it will create that same path every single time. Atmospheric conditions are right, because the physics haven't changed between storms. This is not a quirk or an exception. It is the operating principle. Lightning rods work precisely because they exploit this predictability. They create a reliable, repeated target on a structure to safely channel electricity away from it. The entire field of lightning protection engineering is built on the fact that lightning strikes the same places reliably and repeatedly. The phrase, lightning never strikes the same place twice, appears to have originated as a metaphorical comfort offered after misfortune, meaning your bad luck won't repeat. It was never intended as a physics statement. It migrated from idiom to classroom fact through sheer repetition, and every skyscraper on Earth is a live daily demonstration of how wrong it is. 7. Somewhere in your science education, you absorb the image of a chameleon sitting on a leaf and turning perfectly green, then moving to bark and turning perfectly brown. Nature's ultimate stealth technology, color matched to the environment in real time. This is the cartoonist's version of chameleon biology. Chameleons change color primarily to communicate, to regulate body temperature, and to signal mood and social status, not to match their backgrounds. Their color change is controlled by specialized cells called iridophores that contain nanocrystals which reflect light at different wavelengths when the skin expands or contracts. When a chameleon is genuinely threatened, it often becomes brighter and more conspicuous, not less. When two males are competing, they produce the most vivid, high-contrast colors they are capable of generating. Electric blue, hot orange, patterns that would be catastrophically bad camouflage against any natural surface you can name. Their resting colors are already passably matched to their environment because they evolved in a specific habitat, and they rely primarily on staying completely still as their survival strategy, not on active color matching. The background matching myth survives because staged nature photographs show chameleons on matching backgrounds without disclosing the setup, and because the cartoon version is more interesting than a mood ring with legs trying to impress a girlfriend by turning neon orange in a green forest. 8. Somewhere in a biology classroom, possibly yours, there was a laminated poster of a human tongue divided into neat, color-coded zones. Sweet at the tip, bitter at the back, sour on the sides, salt somewhere in the middle. You colored it in during class. You labeled it carefully. You were tested on it, and you got the answers right. Every answer was wrong. The tongue map is a debunked mistranslation that survived in American classrooms for nearly a century after scientists had already corrected it. The myth originated from a German scientific paper published in 1901 by a researcher named D.P. Honig. What Honig actually reported were slight regional sensitivity variations across the tongue's surface, modest differences that he measured and noted with appropriate scientific caution. The nuance was completely stripped away in translation. American psychologist Edwin Boring popularized the exaggerated, strictly zoned version of the map in 1942, without any of the original caveats, and it entered the educational mainstream from there. Every region of the tongue that has taste buds can detect all basic tastes. Taste receptor cells are distributed across the entire tongue surface without meaningful zone-based restriction. In 1974, researcher Virginia Collings re-examined the original data and confirmed the map was a misrepresentation. Textbooks ignored this correction for decades. A translation error from a 1901 German paper became a laminated classroom poster. That is a game of telephone that lasted 120 years. 9. The most memorable fact most people retain from elementary school American history is that George Washington had wooden teeth. It's strange enough to stick, relatable enough to humanize a marble founding father, and repeated often enough that questioning it feels almost unpatriotic. Washington's dentures were never made of wood. Not once. Not partially. His dental appliances were constructed from hippopotamus ivory, elephant ivory, human teeth sourced likely from enslaved people, and metal alloys and hardware. Washington's surviving dentures, held at the Mount Vernon estate, have been physically analyzed. Wood does not appear. Wood would be a catastrophically impractical dental material because it would swell when wet, crack under pressure, rot rapidly in the oral environment, and harbor bacteria at a rate that would make the wearer's life considerably worse. The wooden teeth myth may have originated because ivory dentures stain and darken with age, potentially resembling grained wood in portraits or in the descriptions of people who saw his prosthetics from a distance. Washington suffered serious dental problems throughout his adult life, losing nearly all his teeth by the time he became president, and his dental pain almost certainly affected his public speaking style, which accounts for some of the stiff-jawed quality in his portraits and contemporary descriptions. Wooden teeth dissolve in water. The man crossed the Delaware River in winter. Elementary school history was not connecting those two facts. 10. Every Thanksgiving narrative hands you the same scene. A long table. Shared food. Pilgrims and Wampanoag people sitting together in genuine goodwill. The founding moment of cross-cultural harmony in America, marked by a feast that somehow became a national holiday. Plymouth Rock sits under a stone portico like a sacred relic, and the whole story rests on a single, enormous problem. There is zero contemporary historical documentation from any of the actual pilgrims describing Plymouth Rock as a landing site at the moment of arrival. Not one account. The first recorded claim that Plymouth Rock was the landing spot came in 1741, more than 120 years after the Mayflower arrived, from a 94-year-old man named Thomas Faunce, who said his father had told him. The Mayflower passengers almost certainly first landed at Provincetown, at the tip of Cape Cod, before relocating to Plymouth. The landing was a process that unfolded over weeks, not a single dramatic moment with a rock. The rock itself has been moved, split, accidentally dropped and broken, and reassembled multiple times since the 18th century. It is not in its original location. Plymouth Rock became a powerful patriotic symbol during the Revolutionary period when colonists needed an origin mythology, and the story expanded to fill that emotional requirement. America's foundational Thanksgiving moment rests on one elderly man's 120-year-old secondhand memory. That is the historical chain of custody, and it gets presented in schools as archaeology. 11. Every struggling math student has been handed this particular consolation at least once, probably by a well-meaning teacher or a parent trying to be encouraging. Einstein failed math as a child, and look how he turned out. The implication being that your poor grade means nothing, that academic failure is practically a prerequisite for genius, and that the standardized test in front of you is meaningless. Einstein excelled at mathematics throughout his entire childhood. He said so himself. He reportedly addressed this myth directly, stating that he had mastered differential and integral calculus before the age of 15. The confusion almost certainly stems from a Swiss grading system inversion. In the Swiss school system Einstein attended, 6 was the highest possible grade and 1 was the lowest. When his excellent scores were reported to German audiences accustomed to a system where 1 is the highest grade, his top marks looked like failures to anyone who didn't know to ask about the scale. Einstein did leave one school, the Luitpold Gymnasium in Munich, but for reasons of pedagogical conflict and disagreement with authoritarian teaching methods, not because he was failing. He scored highest in mathematics and physics on his entrance examination to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, the institution he went on to attend. A feel-good lie for underperforming students accidentally slandered the 20th century's most iconic physicist. He would have been terrible at being bad at math had anyone actually asked him to try. 12. Your biology class gave you a chart. 4 boxes. 4 labels. A, B, AB, and O. Universal donor, universal recipient, the clean grid of human blood. Learn it, memorize it, move on, it's on the test. The ABO system is one of 45 recognized human blood group systems. There are over 600 known blood group antigens identified across these systems, making blood typing significantly more complex than any classroom chart has ever been willing to suggest. The RH factor, the positive or negative designation that most people know and attach to their blood type, is a completely separate blood classification system layered on top of ABO. The Duffy, Kell, KID, and MNS systems are among the dozens of other classification frameworks used in precision medicine, particularly for patients requiring repeated transfusions over time. Some blood types are extraordinarily rare. The Rh-null blood type, which lacks all Rh antigens entirely, has been identified in fewer than 50 people worldwide and is called golden blood in transfusion medicine for its exceptional compatibility. In clinical practice, matching on ABO and Rh alone is a starting point, not a complete compatibility determination. Patients with sickle cell disease require extended antigen matching across multiple systems to receive safe transfusions. The 4-box chart teaches you the beginning of blood typing and presents it as the complete picture. It is the kind of simplification that is harmless until you actually need a blood transfusion. 13. The diamond from coal metaphor has been used in motivational speeches, classroom geology lessons, and inspirational wall art for so long that most people treat it as settled science. Pressure plus coal plus time equals diamond. Even Superman does it in the comics. The actual geology tells a different story. Almost no natural diamonds are formed from coal. The carbon source for the vast majority of natural diamonds is ancient mantle rock, not compressed surface plant material. Most natural diamonds formed between 1 billion and 3.3 billion years ago, then were transported toward the surface by volcanic kimberlite eruptions. Coal requires dead land plant material to form, and significant land plant life didn't exist until roughly 300 to 360 million years ago. Natural diamonds are billions of years older than the plant life required to make coal. The carbon in most diamonds is sourced from ancient marine organisms, or primordial carbon trapped deep in the mantle, deposited long before plants had colonized land. A small subset of diamonds formed in subduction zones may theoretically incorporate biological carbon, but these represent a negligible fraction of all diamonds, and still don't involve coal specifically. The diamond from coal metaphor is used to tell you your potential is extraordinary. It is based on geology that isn't real. You deserve better than a motivational framework built on an error. 14. The Declaration of Independence. July 4th. Fireworks. The day America was born. The signing is the event. The date is the event. The entire national holiday is built on the assumption that July 4th was the day the founders picked up their quill pens and made history official with their signatures. Most delegates did not sign the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. The formal, documented signing ceremony occurred primarily on August 2nd, 1776. The Continental Congress voted to approve independence on July 2nd, 1776, a date that John Adams predicted in writing would be the one celebrated as the nation's birthday for generations to come. Adams was off by 2 days in the wrong direction, and has been slightly annoyed about it in historical retrospect ever since. July 4th is the date the final edited text of the Declaration was approved by Congress, which was a document ratification, not a signing ceremony. Most of the 56 signatures were physically affixed on August 2nd, 1776, during a formal session organized for that purpose. Some delegates signed even later in the year. The date confusion became embedded in American culture because the printed document circulated widely with July 4th, 1776 as its header date, and that date became the public reference. 250 years of fireworks have been aimed at the day a committee approved a document rather than the day independence was voted for, or the day most people actually signed anything. 15. The apple falls. Newton's head is struck. Gravity is invented. It is on classroom walls, in textbooks, in cartoons, in the cultural shorthand for sudden scientific insight across almost every language on Earth. The apple to the head story is, at minimum, a dramatic embellishment of an already uncertain anecdote. And the version where it triggers the discovery of gravity is a fundamental misrepresentation of how scientific knowledge actually develops. Newton was never struck by an apple in any historically reliable account. The story originates primarily from William Stukeley, a friend of Newton's who claimed Newton mentioned the incident during a conversation decades after it supposedly occurred. One other secondhand account also references a falling apple. Newton had been developing his understanding of gravitational mechanics for years before any such incident, drawing extensively on Kepler's laws of planetary motion and his own substantial mathematical work. What Newton contributed to human knowledge was not the realization that heavy objects fall downward. Everyone already knew that. His actual achievement was mathematically describing gravitational force with sufficient precision to demonstrate it was universal, operating the same way between planets as between a tree and the ground below it. One of the greatest mathematical achievements in human history gets reduced in classroom shorthand to a man being hit in the head by fruit. That is how we communicate science to children, and then wonder why adults think breakthroughs happen by accident. 16. You may have spent years believing, possibly still believe, that humans and dinosaurs existed at the same time. The Flintstones version of natural history. The images are cultural, the films are convincing, and it is a genuinely fun idea. Non-avian dinosaurs went extinct approximately 66 million years ago. Anatomically modern humans appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. The gap between those two numbers is approximately 65.7 million years. The Chicxulub asteroid impact around 66 million years ago triggered a mass extinction event that ended non-avian dinosaur dominance. Primates had not yet evolved. The earliest members of the genus Homo appear in the fossil record around 2 to 3 million years ago. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens appear at roughly 300,000 years ago. If you compress the entire history of Earth into a single calendar year beginning on January 1st, non-avian dinosaurs go extinct on approximately December 26th, and modern humans appear with about 11 minutes remaining in the year. We were not neighbors. We were not even in the same geological chapter. There is technically one accurate version of humans and dinosaurs coexist. Birds are avian dinosaurs and represent the one surviving dinosaur lineage, which means every pigeon you've ever found annoying is a dinosaur. But that is not what anyone means when they picture a caveman riding a triceratops, and you know it. 17. Textbooks draw a clean line. 4. 76 AD. The Western Roman Empire falls. History pivots. The ancient world ends on a specific, convenient date, and the Middle Ages begin on the next page. The Eastern Roman Empire, known to history as Byzantium, continued operating for another 977 years after 476 AD, maintaining Roman law, Roman administrative traditions, Roman institutional identity, and a Greek-Latin governmental framework until Ottoman forces captured Constantinople in 1453. In 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, which was administratively significant, but was the culmination of a gradual process spanning generations, not a sudden catastrophic collapse. Historians actively debate whether 476 is even the most meaningful date to use. The Visigoth sack of Rome in 410 and the Vandal sack in 455 are equally significant disruptions by any reasonable measure. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, preserved Roman institutions and continued exercising significant political and military power across the Mediterranean for nearly another millennium. Byzantine scholars fleeing Constantinople after 1453 carried classical texts westward into Italy, directly supplying the intellectual material that seeded the Renaissance. The event textbooks call the End of Rome catalyzed one of the greatest cultural explosions in Western history. Teaching that Rome fell in 476 is like announcing a company went out of business when it closed one of its 2 offices. The other office ran profitably for another 1,000 years, and its closure sparked the Renaissance. 18. The story your science class told you about Marie Curie is true as far as it goes, which is exactly the problem. First woman to win a Nobel Prize. Revolutionary achievement, barrier broken. The story stops there, wraps itself in a bow, and moves on to the next lesson. What it consistently fails to mention is that she then won a second Nobel Prize in a completely different scientific discipline, making her the first person of any gender in history to achieve that. The 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded for research on radioactivity, shared with her husband Pierre and Henri Becquerel. The Nobel Committee had initially planned to exclude Marie entirely. Pierre found out and explicitly demanded she be included, or he would decline. She received the prize. Then, in 1911, after Pierre's death, she won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the isolation of pure radium and polonium. She is still the only person ever to win Nobel Prizes in two different sciences. She was also denied membership in the French Academy of Sciences her entire life, even after both prizes, because she was a woman. Schools teach Marie Curie as a first woman story and leave out the part where she immediately doubled the achievement. The sequel is more remarkable than the original, and somehow ended up as a footnote. 19. You've probably repeated this one yourself, possibly to a child, possibly to a doctor, possibly with the confident tone of someone sharing a biological fact they have personally verified. Every 7 years, every cell in your body is replaced. You are, in a literal physical sense, a completely new person. Different cells in your body have wildly different lifespans, and several key cell populations are never meaningfully replaced at all. Red blood cells live approximately 120 days and are continuously produced by bone marrow. The lining of your intestine turns over every 3 to 5 days. Liver cells replace over roughly 150 to 500 days. Bone cells replace over approximately 10 years. Your neurons, the cells doing the actual thinking, the ones processing this sentence right now, are largely the ones you were born with. The cerebral cortex does not meaningfully regenerate neurons throughout your lifetime. Heart muscle cells replace at approximately 1% per year, meaning that by age 75, roughly half your heart muscle cells are original equipment from the day you were born. The new body every 7 years idea requires you to simultaneously ignore the neurons you're using to believe it, the heart beating while you do, and the bones holding you upright. None of them received the memo about the 7-year schedule. 20. The goldfish memory myth is arguably the most successful piece of animal misinformation in popular culture, and it has done real damage to the reputation of an animal that deserves considerably better from the species mocking it. 3 seconds. Small brain, small memory, and therefore you can tell this joke and feel superior to a fish. Goldfish have memory spans measurable in months. They can be trained using standard conditioning techniques. They recognize their owners. They associate feeding times, specific people, and specific locations with food. Researchers at Plymouth University trained goldfish to push a lever to receive food. The fish not only learned the task, but retained it for months afterward without reinforcement. Their brains include regions associated with learning and memory that function in ways analogous to memory structures in vertebrates, far higher on the scale we use to decide which animals we respect. The myth's precise origin is unclear, but it appears to have spread as a cultural joke that was repeated often enough to acquire the status of biological fact. At some point, it migrated from comedy to classroom, which is a trajectory that tells you more about how educational facts get established than it does about goldfish. The goldfish memory myth has survived in human culture for decades. The goldfish, meanwhile, definitely remembers where its food comes from. 21. Every American child learns Benjamin Franklin, kite, key, lightning, electricity discovered, It is probably the most famous science experiment in the entire American education system. The founding father who reached into the sky and tamed the electrical storm. Franklin did not discover electricity. Electricity was a known and actively studied phenomenon for decades before Franklin flew anything near a thundercloud. William Gilbert coined the term electricity in 1600. Electrical phenomena, including static electricity and the behavior of certain materials under friction, had been studied systematically since at least the early 1600s. Franklin's 1752 kite experiment, to the extent it occurred as documented, demonstrated that lightning and electrical sparks were the same phenomenon. That is a genuinely important scientific insight. It is not the discovery of electricity. There is also serious historical debate about whether Franklin actually conducted the kite experiment himself, or whether it was primarily a thought experiment that was later dramatized. His own written account appeared only after a French scientist had already performed a similar demonstration. His practical invention, the lightning rod, had enormous and immediate real-world impact. But Franklin made a very important observation about one aspect of an already known phenomenon does not fit neatly on a classroom wall. So the story became, Franklin discovered electricity, which is a tidier lie than the complicated truth. 22. American civics class teaches you that the United States is a democracy. The word appears in political speeches, in textbooks, in the phrase "our democracy," used by every politician across every party in every election year. The founders read extensive accounts of Athenian democracy, concluded it was a system dangerously prone to mob rule, and deliberately built something different. The United States is a constitutional federal republic. James Madison argued in Federalist No. 10 explicitly against pure democracy, warning of the dangers of majority faction, and advocating for a representative republic as a structurally superior alternative. The Electoral College means citizens vote for electors who choose the president, not a direct national popular vote. A candidate can win the presidency while losing the popular vote, which has happened 5 times. The Senate gives equal representation to Wyoming, with a population of roughly 580,000 people, and California, with a population of roughly 39 million, which is a deliberately anti-majoritarian design. The Bill of Rights exists specifically to protect individual and minority rights from majority decision-making, which is a structural counter-democratic feature built into the founding document. The founders designed something else on purpose and wrote extensively about why. Calling the result a democracy is less civics education than national brand management, and it has been in the curriculum long enough that questioning it feels vaguely unpatriotic. 23. Every film, every documentary, every dramatization of pyramid construction gives you the same image. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved people hauling massive stones across desert sand under the overseer's whip. It is the visual shorthand for ancient Egypt, and it appears in the Ten Commandments, in textbooks, and in popular history treatments as established fact. Archaeological evidence discovered over the last 30 years has substantially revised this picture. In 1990, worker tombs were discovered near the pyramids at Giza. These were substantial, carefully constructed tombs, indicating that the people buried in them were accorded respect and social recognition. Enslaved workers did not receive dignified burials in ancient Egypt. In 2013, papyrus records found at Wadi al-Jarf became the oldest known papyri in Egypt and documented the logistics of pyramid construction, including rations of bread and beer provided to workers. Skeletal analysis of the worker remains shows evidence of hard physical labor alongside evidence of organized medical care, healed fractures, survived amputations, signs of surgical intervention. Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, who led the excavation of the workers' village, has consistently stated the evidence points to a paid workforce that likely understood the work as a form of religious service. A film from 1956 beat archaeologists to the classroom and has been winning that argument ever since. 24, this one is so intuitive, so geometrically obvious, that even students who paid attention in earth science class still carry it into adulthood without questioning it. Summer is hot because Earth is closer to the sun. Winter is cold because it's farther away. It follows a logic so clean and self-evident that the actual answer sounds like a trick. Earth's seasons are caused by axial tilt, not by orbital distance. Your planet is tilted approximately 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane. In summer, one hemisphere tilts toward the sun, receiving more direct sunlight at a higher angle for more hours per day. In winter, that hemisphere tilts away. The distance difference between Earth's closest approach to the sun and its farthest point is roughly 3% of the total distance, which is not enough to drive the temperature swings you experience between January and July. Earth is actually closest to the sun in early January during northern hemisphere winter, and farthest in early July during northern hemisphere summer. The distance theory also cannot explain why the northern and southern hemispheres have opposite seasons simultaneously, which axial tilt explains perfectly and orbital distance cannot explain at all. A study found that a notable percentage of Harvard graduates, diplomas in hand on graduation day, still explain seasons using the distance model when asked. The misconception is remarkably persistent. Earth is closest to the sun on January 3rd. Boston is buried under snow. 25. The Great Fire of London story has a satisfying narrative arc. The city burns, the plague ends, fire as accidental cure for epidemic. It is taught as a tidy historical package in which catastrophe inadvertently produces benefit, and it has the kind of cause and effect logic that sticks easily in a classroom. The problem is that the Black Death's major London outbreaks had already declined significantly before the fire started. The last major plague epidemic in London was in 1665. The Great Fire broke out in September 1666. The plague was already substantially subsiding through natural epidemic cycling by the time the first bakery on Pudding Lane caught fire. The fire burned primarily through the city's commercial districts and wealthier areas, not through the overcrowded poor neighborhoods where plague conditions were worst. It did not systematically eliminate London's rat population. European plague outbreaks continued for decades after 1666 in other cities across the continent, and further outbreaks occurred in other parts of England following the fire without any cleansing conflagration to explain them. The Great Fire of London killed hundreds of people and destroyed 13,000 homes. It did not end the plague it gets credited with stopping. History assembled a neat narrative from two events that happened close together in time, and classrooms adopted the narrative because proximity looked enough like causation. 26. Cleopatra is Egypt. She appears in Egyptian dress, with Egyptian makeup, ruling from an Egyptian throne, wrapped entirely in the visual aesthetic of the ancient Egyptian world. She is the face of ancient Egyptian civilization in popular history, in films, in textbooks. Cleopatra VII was ethnically Macedonian Greek. She was a descendant of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt after Alexander's death. Her ancestry traces back to Macedonian Greek rulers, and her primary cultural and political heritage was Hellenistic. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. For the majority of that dynasty, the rulers did not bother learning the Egyptian language or adopting Egyptian cultural practices in any meaningful depth. Cleopatra was reportedly the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language at all, in addition to several others, which would have been an unremarkable thing to mention if she were simply an Egyptian woman ruling her own country. Ancient Alexandria, where she governed, was culturally a Greek city built on Egyptian soil, by a Greek general, administered in Greek, and oriented toward the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world. She was about as ethnically Egyptian as British colonial governors of India were Indian. She ruled Egypt. She was not from there. The costume department convinced several generations of students otherwise. 27. This one lives in textbooks, in science documentaries, in the language of what makes humans unique. Tool use was held for decades as the bright definitive line between human cognition and animal behavior. The argument was simple. We make tools. Animals don't. The trait is therefore the marker of human exceptionalism. Tool use has been documented in dozens of species, and the observation has been consistent enough for long enough that the claim of human uniqueness on this front is no longer scientifically defensible. Jane Goodall's 1960 observations of chimpanzees stripping leaves from twigs to extract termites from mounds were so disruptive to the existing framework that her mentor Louis Leakey reportedly said they would need to redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans. New Caledonian crows manufacture hooked tools from plant material, select the appropriate tool for specific tasks, and have been observed carrying preferred tools with them for future use, which demonstrates planning and something resembling tool economy. Bottlenose dolphins in Shark Bay, Australia, carry marine sponges on their rostra while foraging to protect their snouts from the seafloor, a behavior transmitted culturally from mother to offspring across generations. The veined octopus collects discarded coconut shell halves, carries them significant distances, and reassembles them into portable shelters. Humans kept moving the goalposts. Every time another species cleared the bar, someone went back to rewrite the section of the textbook about what makes us special. 28. The Iron Maiden. The spiked metal cabinet shaped like a human body. The centerpiece of every medieval torture museum, depicted in educational settings as grim evidence of medieval brutality, presented as an artifact of a particularly cruel period in European history. There is no reliable historical evidence that Iron Maidens were actually used as torture devices during the medieval period. None. Historian Malte Preetzel and other medievalists have searched the contemporaneous documentary record and found no descriptions of Iron Maidens in use as instruments of punishment or interrogation during the Middle Ages. Many of the surviving examples in museums appear to be 18th and 19th century theatrical constructions assembled from unrelated antique components to satisfy growing tourist demand for Gothic drama. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden, perhaps the most famous example in the world, was assembled from unrelated parts in the early 19th century, and its claimed history of medieval use was largely fabricated for paying visitors. The period of museum exhibit construction coincides precisely with the Gothic revival in European art and architecture, when public fascination with medieval darkness created a market for dramatic artifacts, whether or not the artifacts had genuine medieval provenance. History museums have been displaying 19th century prop department work as medieval archaeology. The Middle Ages were brutal enough without requiring manufactured evidence, but the manufactured version made it into the curriculum anyway. 29. Italian pasta, Marco Polo, China. The Silk Road carrying noodles westward in the luggage of a Venetian explorer who returned in 1295 and handed Italy its defining culinary identity. It is a story of cultural exchange that gets repeated in history classes, in food documentaries, and in Italian restaurant mythology as a tidy explanation for one of the world's most beloved foods. A Genoese soldier's will, dated 1279, 16 years before Marco Polo returned from China, lists among his possessions a basket of macaroni. That is documentary evidence of pasta in Italy predating Marco Polo's trip home. The first documented link between Marco Polo and pasta origins appeared in a 1929 issue of the Macaroni Journal, an American trade publication. It was a fictional story written to promote pasta consumption among American readers, not a historical account sourced from any archive or primary document. Arab traders likely introduced dried pasta to Sicily during their occupation of the island in the 9th through 11th centuries before Marco Polo was born. Chinese noodles and Italian pasta are made from different grains using substantially different techniques, suggesting the two traditions evolved independently rather than one deriving from the other. The origin story of Italian pasta was invented by an American macaroni trade newsletter during Prohibition. The most Italian food in the world owes its founding myth to a marketing pamphlet. 30. The name is the joke, and the joke is the history lesson. Thomas Crapper, the man whose name became slang, invented the toilet. It is one of the most satisfying etymological coincidences in engineering history, and it gets taught, repeated, and passed down with the confidence of someone who has personally verified the plumbing records. Thomas Crapper was a real person, a genuinely skilled plumber and sanitary engineer who lived from 1836 to 1910 and held 9 patents for various bathroom hardware improvements. He did not invent the flush toilet. Sir John Harrington designed and built a functioning flush toilet for Queen Elizabeth Tharp in 1596, publishing the design in a pamphlet. That is 240 years before Crapper was born. Alexander Cummings received the first patent for a flush toilet design in 1775. Joseph Brema improved the design further in 1778. Crapper developed a successful ballcock mechanism for cisterns, contributed meaningfully to the refinement of bathroom hardware, and ran a successful plumbing business. He was a legitimate engineer who worked in the right industry at the right time. The word crap predates Crapper in English dictionaries, appearing in the mid-19th century, meaning his name was unfortunate rather than generative. He is one of the few people in history whose entire fame rests on having a funny name and working near the relevant invention without being the one who invented it. 31. Fortune cookies. Chinese restaurants. Chinese tradition. The folded wafer with the philosophical message inside is treated as an authentic artifact of Chinese culinary culture, as naturally Chinese as dim sum or Peking duck. Fortune cookies were invented in California, almost certainly by Japanese Americans. In the early 20th century, they are largely unknown as a traditional food item in China. The leading historical claim attributes the fortune cookie to Makoto Hagiwara, a Japanese American who managed the Japanese tea garden in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park and reportedly served them to guests around 1914. A competing claim credits David Jung, a Chinese-American noodle maker in Los Angeles, who reportedly distributed them in 1918. A San Francisco federal court ceremonially ruled in favor of the Hagiwara claim in 1983, which is an extraordinary thing for a court to have spent time on. During World War II, Japanese Americans were forcibly interned, and Chinese-American entrepreneurs took over Japanese-owned businesses, including fortune cookie factories, which significantly accelerated the association of fortune cookies with Chinese restaurants specifically. When fortune cookies were introduced to China in the 1990s, they were marketed as genuine American imports, the complete reversal of their assumed cultural direction. Fortune cookies are a Japanese-American invention that became associated with Chinese restaurants after Japanese Americans were imprisoned by their own government. They are so thoroughly not Chinese that China was introduced to them as an American novelty. 32. Put a metal rod on your roof and you are inviting lightning to strike your building. The logic is straightforward and sounds like physics. Metal conducts electricity. Lightning is electricity. The rod is therefore a target that attracts strikes that would not otherwise have occurred. Lightning rods do not attract lightning. They provide a controlled, low-resistance path for lightning that would strike the structure anyway, safely directing the current into the ground rather than through the building's walls, wiring, and occupants. Lightning seeks the path of least electrical resistance to the ground. A tall structure in a relatively flat landscape already represents a preferred path regardless of whether any rod is present. The rod doesn't create the preference. It manages the inevitable. Benjamin Franklin's original design, proposed in 1752, was based precisely on this principle. Provide a safe discharge path for the electricity that will come regardless. A properly grounded lightning rod system dramatically reduces structural fires and damage from lightning strikes, which would not be the outcome if the rod simply created additional strikes without managing where they went. Some researchers have proposed that pointed rods may generate a small upward electrical leader that intercepts downward strokes in a limited local sense. But this is active scientific discussion, not a reversal of the fundamental principle. A lightning rod on a skyscraper doesn't make the skyscraper a better target. The skyscraper was already the best target in the neighborhood before anyone installed anything. 33. Every school health class delivered this with the kind of authority usually reserved for facts that have actually been verified. Drinking alcohol destroys brain cells permanently. Each drink eliminates neurons you will never recover. It was the biological pillar of anti-drinking education, delivered to students who had no way to evaluate the claim and every reason to assume their teacher had checked. What alcohol actually does is more nuanced, and the nuance matters both for understanding the risk and for understanding how health education selects its messaging. Moderate alcohol consumption does not kill neurons directly. A 1993 study by Roberta Pentney at the University of Buffalo found that alcohol damaged dendritic branching in cerebellar neurons, the connective extensions between neurons, but did not cause significant neuron death at moderate intake levels. Heavy chronic alcohol abuse does kill neurons, primarily through several indirect mechanisms, including severe thiamine deficiency, which causes Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome and produces serious and permanent neurological damage. Alcohol also suppresses neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, in the hippocampus, which affects memory and learning in ways that are distinct from killing existing cells. The kills brain cells framing was a temperance-era simplification that health education adopted because the accurate version does not fit on a poster. The inaccuracy stuck, not because it was true, but because it was sufficiently alarming and short enough to memorize. 34. You have heard this one delivered as folk wisdom, as parental instruction, and as what sounds like common sense biology with just enough anatomical logic to seem plausible. Always wear a hat in winter because you lose most of your body heat through your head. The percentage attached to this varies dramatically by who is telling it. Sometimes 30%, sometimes 40%, sometimes 90%. The number scaling upward in proportion to how cold the speaker wants you to feel about going outside without a hat. The head accounts for roughly 7 to 10% of body heat loss in adults, which is proportional to its surface area as a fraction of the body's total. There is no physiological mechanism that makes the head a disproportionate heat radiator compared to other body parts of similar surface area. The myth most likely originated from a 1950s United States military cold weather survival study in which test subjects wore full Arctic survival suits with their heads left uncovered. Of course, the head lost the most heat in that scenario. It was the only part of the body exposed to the cold. The finding was then generalized into universal guidance, which is roughly equivalent to testing people with one bare hand and concluding hands lose the most heat. In infants, the head is proportionally much larger relative to body size, making infant heat loss through the head genuinely more significant, which may be the biological seed of the adult generalization. The experiment designed the result. The result became the advice. 35. Henry VIII and his 6 wives get taught as a story about one man's spectacular moral failures, and the 6 marriages are presented as evidence of personal depravity, so extreme it reshaped a nation. The framing is not wrong exactly, but it is dramatically incomplete in ways that matter for understanding why any of it happened. Henry VIII's marriages were primarily driven by a dynastic crisis of genuine political urgency. Catherine of Aragon had 6 pregnancies, resulting in only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary, and no living male heir. In a monarchy where legitimate male succession was understood as the foundation of political stability, this was not a personal disappointment. It was a governing emergency. The English Reformation, one of the most consequential religious and political ruptures in Western history, was triggered by Henry's need for an annulment that Rome would not grant, not by any abstract theological disagreement with Catholicism. The break with Rome was a byproduct of the succession problem, not its own independent cause. Anne Boleyn was executed on charges of adultery and treason that most modern historians consider fabricated or at minimum deeply suspect, likely orchestrated by political rivals exploiting Henry's anxiety about male heirs as a weapon. Jane Seymour, wife number 3, produced the male heir Edward VI, which ended the immediate dynastic crisis. The personal and the political were the same thing. Textbooks separated them. 36, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is shot in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, and the First World War starts. Assassination equals cause. It is presented in virtually every textbook as the clean triggering event that explains a world war, the moment history pivoted. The assassination was a spark. The powder keg was decades of interlocking alliances, imperial competition, military buildup, nationalist movements, and a diplomatic system so structurally rigid that it converted a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe in roughly 6 weeks of decision-making. The alliance system, meaning the Triple Entente against the Triple Alliance, meant that a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia automatically activated treaty obligations, pulling in Russia, then Germany, then France, then Britain in sequence. This architecture predated the assassination by decades and was not created by it. Germany had developed the Schlieffen Plan, a war strategy requiring rapid Western attack through Belgium before turning east, which once activated made Belgian neutrality irrelevant to German military logic and British neutrality practically impossible. Imperial competition for colonies, trade routes, and influence had created sustained tension between the major powers for 30 years before anyone fired a shot in Sarajevo. The July crisis involved dozens of diplomatic decisions by multiple governments over 6 weeks, and several different choices at several different points could have localized the conflict. Blaming World War I on the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is like blaming a house fire on the match while ignoring that someone built the house out of explosives. 37, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation and slavery ends in America. It is presented as the definitive legal act of abolition, the moment of liberation, the document that resolved the central moral catastrophe of American history. The Emancipation Proclamation applied only to enslaved people in Confederate states, currently in active rebellion against the United States, and the Confederacy did not recognize Lincoln's authority, which meant its immediate practical effect in those states was close to zero. The proclamation explicitly exempted enslaved people in the border states that had not seceded, including Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, and also exempted specific Union-controlled Confederate regions, including parts of Louisiana and Virginia. These were areas where the federal government actually had enforcement authority, and they were carved out. The document declared freedom in territories where Lincoln had no enforcement power and exempted territories where he did. The proclamation had enormous symbolic and political significance, particularly in reframing the war explicitly as a fight against slavery and discouraging European nations from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. That significance is real and substantial. But freed all enslaved people is a third-grade summary that omits the parts a civics class requires. Legal abolition of slavery throughout the United States required the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. 38. You are a visual learner, or an auditory learner, or a kinesthetic learner, and your education should be structured around that modality. You have probably been told which one you are. You may have advocated for instruction matched to your style. Teachers have built curricula around this framework for decades. The learning styles hypothesis, meaning the idea that people have stable and categorically distinct learning modalities that predict instructional effectiveness, has been repeatedly and rigorously tested in controlled educational research and consistently not supported. A comprehensive review published in 2008 in Psychological Science in the Public Interest examined the evidence base for learning styles and concluded that the contrast between the enormous popularity of the approach within education and the lack of credible evidence for its utility was striking and disturbing. For the learning styles hypothesis to be valid, studies would need to demonstrate what researchers call crossover interactions, meaning visual learners genuinely outperforming auditory learners when taught visually, and vice versa in reverse conditions. This specific pattern is consistently not found. The human brain does not process information through isolated sensory channels. Comprehension involves multiple cognitive systems simultaneously. The learning styles industry, including tests, curricula, teacher training, and certification programs, is estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which creates powerful commercial incentives to maintain belief in the framework, regardless of what the research actually shows. You didn't struggle because of mismatched modalities. The curriculum was just hard. 39, left-brained or right-brained. Logical and analytical, or creative and intuitive. The framework appears in educational materials, corporate training programs, personality assessments, and casual self-description with the confidence of neuroscientific consensus behind it. There is no neuroscientific consensus behind it. A 2013 University of Utah study analyzed brain scans of over 1,000 people and found no evidence of individuals consistently using one hemisphere more than the other. Network connectivity was roughly symmetrical across subjects regardless of their self-reported personality type or cognitive style. Hemispheric specialization does exist as a real neurological phenomenon. Language processing is lateralized to the left hemisphere in most right-handed people, and certain spatial processing tasks show right hemisphere dominance. These are specific functional asymmetries documented in research. They are not personality-level dichotomies that divide people into two categories. The popular framework was extrapolated from the Nobel Prize-winning split-brain research of Roger Sperry in the 1960s, which studied patients whose corpus callosum had been surgically severed. Generalizing findings from people with severed brain hemispheres to people with fully intact, normally connected brains is a significant misapplication of the research. The left brain, right brain personality system is the Myers-Briggs test of neuroscience. Beloved by institutions, taught in schools, commercially durable, and consistently unsupported by the research it claims as its foundation. Your brain is using both hemispheres to understand why you think you're only using one of them. 40. Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, and the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma believed him to be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, which is why the Aztecs failed to resist effectively. Divine confusion handed the empire to the Spanish. It is one of the most repeated stories in the history of colonial encounter, presented as a psychological explanation for the conquest's outcome. The Quetzalcoatl identification story is disputed by most modern historians and appears to have been significantly shaped or invented in the decades after the conquest, largely through accounts recorded and filtered by Spanish colonizers and their indigenous informants operating within the colonial context. Historian Camilla Townsend's research, published in Fifth Sun in 2019, argues the narrative was largely constructed after the fact to serve both Spanish colonial interests in framing the conquest as divinely ordained and certain indigenous political purposes in the post-conquest period. Moctezuma's actual military responses, deploying significant forces and attempting to monitor and limit Cortés's movement through controlled hospitality, are not consistent with the behavior of a leader who believed he was welcoming a deity back to his own realm. The factors that actually determined the conquest's outcome include devastating smallpox epidemics, extensive military alliances with indigenous peoples who resented Aztec tributary demands, Spanish weapons and tactical advantages, and deep political divisions within the empire. One of those explanations requires actually understanding what the Aztec Empire was. The other fits in a single dramatic sentence. Classrooms chose the sentence. 41. Walt Disney arranged to be cryogenically frozen upon his death, his body suspended in liquid nitrogen somewhere beneath Disneyland, awaiting a future technology capable of reviving him. It is one of the most persistent celebrity death myths in modern culture, repeated with the comfortable confidence of someone who heard it from someone who heard it from someone who swears it's true. Walt Disney was cremated on December 17, 1966, 2 days after his death from lung cancer. His ashes were interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. His death certificate confirms it. His family has confirmed it. The first verified human cryopreservation in history occurred on January 12, 1967, nearly a month after Disney's death, meaning Disney could not have been the first human frozen even if he had wanted to be, because the technology was not yet being applied to human subjects when he died. The myth appears to have originated in a 1972 book and circulated through tabloids before entering general cultural consciousness. The organization that performed the first human cryopreservation was not operational in the way the myth requires when Disney died. Walt Disney spent his career building the most powerful mythology factory in the history of entertainment. He became the subject of mythology himself within 6 years of his death. He is in Forest Lawn. He is not in a tank. The frozen body story would have made a terrible Disney film because it has no resolution. 42. The Great Wall of China was built by one civilization, under one governing ambition, as one unified engineering project expressing the will and power of Chinese civilization across a defined historical period. That is the textbook version. The Great Wall is not a single continuous wall. It is a series of multiple walls, fortifications, barriers, and ramparts built, rebuilt, extended, and abandoned by different states and dynasties over approximately 2,000 years, using different materials, different labor forces, following different routes for different strategic purposes. The earliest wall-building efforts in northern China date to the 7th century BC, during the Warring States period, when individual competing states built walls primarily to defend against each other and against northern nomadic peoples. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, connected and extended existing walls around 221 BC, which is the origin of the unified concept. But these early sections were earthen-rammed earth construction, largely unrecognizable today and minimal compared to what came later. The massive stone walls that appear in photographs, on postcards, and in every classroom illustration date primarily from the Ming Dynasty, built between 1368 and 1644, more than 1,500 years after the Qin sections. The total length of all wall sections across all dynasties is estimated at over 13,000 miles. Calling this singular structure the Great Wall is roughly like calling every road ever built in Europe the Roman Road. Multiple builders, multiple centuries, multiple purposes. The name conceals the complexity it should convey. 43. Charles Darwin, Survival of the Fittest, Social Darwinism. The phrase is attributed to Darwin. The social philosophy applied from it is treated as an extension of Darwinian thought. It appears in history, curricula, as the intellectual foundation that justified colonialism, eugenics, and economic exploitation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and Darwin's name carries the weight of all of it. Survival of the Fittest was coined by Herbert Spencer in 1864 in his Principles of Biology, where Spencer applied his own pre-existing social philosophy to evolutionary concepts. Darwin later adopted the phrase in the 5th edition of On the Origin of Species while explicitly crediting Spencer, but it was not Darwin's original framing, and it was not the language Darwin preferred for his theory. Darwin's later work, The Descent of Man, published in 1871, explicitly argued that sympathy, cooperation, and moral sentiment were evolved traits crucial to human social success, which is the opposite of competitive social Darwinist frameworks. Natural selection operates on reproductive success in specific environmental contexts. It does not operate on an abstract scale of superiority between human groups or races or classes, which is what social Darwinism required the theory to say. Social Darwinism is to Darwin what the Inquisition is to the teachings of Jesus. People who came after took a foundational idea, applied it in ways the originator didn't endorse, and the originator's name got permanently attached to the result. 44. The ancient Olympic Games are taught as the noble historical precedent for the modern Olympics, a universal ideal of athletic competition above politics, in which rival city-states set aside conflict for the pure spirit of sport. The ancient Olympics were a specifically Greek religious festival from which non-Greeks were categorically and deliberately excluded. You had to be a free Greek man to compete. Women could not compete. Married women were forbidden from attending as spectators under penalty of death. Enslaved people were barred. The Olympic truce, the Ekecheiria, suspended local hostilities among Greek city-states to allow safe travel to the site at Olympia. It was not a general peace, and it did not apply to any conflicts with non-Greek peoples, which is a considerable limitation on the universal peace framing. The games were held under the religious auspices of Zeus, and were explicitly a celebration of Greek ethnic and cultural identity, not a celebration of shared humanity. The Pancration, one of the featured events, was a combined wrestling and fighting competition with almost no rules. Choking was permitted. Joint breaking was permitted. Deaths occurred during the competition and were not disqualifying. The spirit of the ancient games that modern Olympic rhetoric invokes has been substantially upgraded in the retelling. The founders of the modern Olympic movement projected a universal ideal backward onto an ethnically exclusive Greek religious festival, and nobody pushed back hard enough on the history. 45. Humans originated in the Middle East, or in the Mediterranean world, or somewhere in the general vicinity of the civilizations that wrote the history you were taught. The geography of human origins in popular understanding tracks closely with the geography of the texts that defined Western education, which is not a coincidence and is not accurate. Anatomically, modern humans originated in Africa. The oldest confirmed fossils of Homo sapiens, found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, are dated to approximately 300,000 years ago. The Omo remains from Ethiopia are dated to approximately 195,000 years ago. Genetic analysis of human mitochondrial DNA traces all living humans back to a common maternal ancestor who lived in Africa approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. The out-of-Africa model, supported by converging evidence from genetics, the fossil record, and archaeology, proposes that anatomically modern humans expanded out of Africa roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago and populated the rest of the world from there. Some interbreeding with archaic human populations, including Neanderthals and Denisovans outside Africa, is now confirmed through ancient DNA analysis. But the primary origin of modern human populations is unambiguously African. Every human being alive today traces their ancestry back to Africa. This is not a contested scientific claim. It is the consensus position of genetics, paleoanthropology, and archaeology. The Middle East is where some humans went after leaving, not where any of them started. 46. Sharks must keep swimming or they die. Stop moving. Stop breathing. Stop living. It is taught as a defining fact of shark biology and used as a metaphor for what happens when you stop pushing forward in your own life, which is the kind of motivational application that should immediately make you suspicious of the underlying science. The requirement to swim continuously applies only to obligate RAM ventilators, which is a subset of shark species that breathe by forcing water over their gills through forward motion. Great white sharks, mako sharks, and whale sharks fall into this category. Approximately half of all shark species are buccal pumpers, capable of actively pumping water over their gills using muscles in the throat, which means they can rest stationary on the seafloor for extended periods without suffocating. Nurse sharks are frequently photographed motionless on the seafloor. Caribbean reef sharks have been observed resting in underwater caves during daylight hours. Even great white sharks have been observed in apparent low-activity resting states near the water's surface. The claim, as it is typically taught, attributes a characteristic of certain shark species to all sharks, which is the biological equivalent of noting that some birds cannot fly, and concluding, therefore, that flight is not a bird behavior. The nurse shark disagrees with the myth and will continue napping on the seafloor, regardless of what your health class poster said. 47. The Pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower in 1620, and Europeans arrived in North America. It is the founding arrival in American history education, the beginning of the story, presented as the point at which the continent entered recorded history and European presence began. Norse settlers established a confirmed settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, around 1000 AD, approximately 620 years before the Mayflower sailed. This is not a disputed claim. L'Anse aux Meadows was discovered archaeologically in 1960, confirmed through multiple subsequent excavations, and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Norse sagas describe expeditions by Leif Erikson and others to a land west of Greenland, and the physical settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows confirms actual Norse presence in North America 5 centuries before Columbus and more than 6 centuries before Plymouth. St. Augustine in Florida was founded by Spanish colonist Pedro Menendez de Avilés in 1565, 55 years before Plymouth Rock, making it the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. Jamestown, Virginia was established in 1607, 13 years before Plymouth. The Spanish had been operating in the Caribbean, Mexico, Florida, and the American Southwest for over a century before the Mayflower left England. The Pilgrims arrived in a neighborhood Europeans had been visiting, settling, and colonizing for at least 600 years. They were not first. They were the particular group whose origin story became the national mythology, which required quietly relocating an entire Viking settlement. 48. Bats are blind. The idiom exists, you know it, and it carries the implication of biological fact because it seems to follow logically from everything else you know about bats. They use echolocation. Echolocation compensates for absent vision. Therefore, the vision must be absent. All bat species have functional eyes and can see. The premise of the idiom is false for every bat that has ever existed. Megabats, the large fruit bats sometimes called flying foxes, have large and well-developed eyes and rely primarily on vision and smell for navigation and food location. They do not use echolocation at all in most cases. Microbats, the smaller insect-eating species most people picture when they think of bats, do use echolocation as a primary hunting and navigation tool, but they also have functional vision and use it actively in brighter light conditions. Research has shown that microbats can switch between visual navigation and echolocation depending on available light and the specific demands of the task, which is only possible if both systems are operational. The idiom blind as a bat appears to have originated from observing bats behaving erratically in direct bright light, which was misread as visual impairment. What was actually happening is that echolocation becomes less effective relative to the visual noise of bright daylight, creating apparent disorientation in an animal that isn't blind at all. Bats have had functioning eyes for tens of millions of years. One colloquial phrase became classroom biology. 49. The Pilgrims were the first Europeans in North America was the previous myth. This one is adjacent and equally embedded. The idea that the pre-Columbian Americas were largely uninhabited wilderness, sparsely populated by scattered small groups living in a state of nature, and that Europeans arrived in a vast empty landscape and built civilization on it. Pre-Columbian Americas were home to an estimated 50 to 100 million people across complex civilizations, sophisticated trade networks, intensive agricultural systems, and urban centers that matched or exceeded the population of contemporary European cities. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, had an estimated population of 200,000 to 300,000 inhabitants at its height, making it larger than any European city of that era. Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, was a major urban center of the Mississippian culture, with a population potentially exceeding 20,000 people around 1100 AD, which made it larger than contemporary London. Epidemic diseases, including smallpox, measles, and influenza introduced by Europeans, killed an estimated 50 to 90% of indigenous populations across the Americas within 100 to 150 years of initial contact, the single largest demographic catastrophe in human history. The wilderness that later European colonists described as empty and untouched was in most cases actively managed agricultural and ecological landscape that had been depopulated. It was not empty because it had never been occupied. It was empty because the people had died. Calling it empty land was the founding myth of a real estate transaction. 50. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. 1876. The clean founding story of telecommunications, presented as uncontested invention history, with Bell's place in it as settled as any fact in the curriculum. Elisha Gray filed a patent caveat for a telephone design on February 14, 1876. Alexander Graham Bell filed his patent application on the same day. Bell's application was processed first by a matter of hours, under circumstances that were disputed at the time and remain debated by historians. Bell received the patent. Antonio Meucci, an Italian inventor, developed a working voice communication device as early as 1854 and filed a patent caveat in 1871, 5 years before Bell's famous patent. Meucci could not afford the $10 annual renewal fee and allowed his caveat to lapse. In 2002, the United States Congress passed a resolution explicitly recognizing Meucci's contributions to the invention of the telephone. Bell Telephone Company faced over 600 patent challenges in the decades following the 1876 patent, including challenges from Gray's backers, which suggests the invention claim was genuinely and legally contested rather than straightforwardly settled. Bell himself reportedly never installed a telephone in his own home study because he found the device an unwelcome intrusion on his work. The inventor of the telephone famously declined to use the telephone. The inventor of the telephone is the person whose paperwork arrived first on a specific bureaucratic morning, which is how patent offices decide history and why history is sometimes wrong. 51. The Titanic was declared unsinkable by its builders. The White Star Line marketed it on that guarantee, and the sinking was therefore the cosmic punishment for human arrogance, a hubris story that writes itself. Every textbook treatment implies or states the unsinkable claim as an official corporate position that the disaster then dramatically refuted. White Star Line never officially marketed the Titanic as unsinkable. The Shipbuilder magazine described the ship's watertight compartment design as making it practically unsinkable in a 1911 trade publication, which is a qualified engineering assessment, not a corporate guarantee, and not the same sentence. The practically was doing significant work in that description and was stripped out in subsequent retellings. White Star Line's actual promotional materials emphasized the ship's size, luxury appointments, and speed. The unsinkable framing was amplified primarily by newspaper coverage before and after the disaster and retrospectively attached to the company's reputation. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, understood the compartment system's fatal limitation clearly. It could handle flooding in 4 consecutive compartments. The iceberg breached 5. He knew the math. Captain Edward Smith had made a public statement years earlier expressing confidence in modern shipbuilding generally, a quote later misattributed to White Star and misrepresented as a specific guarantee about the Titanic. The arrogance narrative is more satisfying than the actual story, which is that a well-designed ship encountered damage slightly beyond what its designers had engineered it to survive, and the newspapers invented the hubris afterward. 52. The Black Death and Rats. Every documentary, every textbook illustration, every dramatic recreation of medieval plague features rats swarming through city streets, carrying the fleas that carried the bacterium that killed a third of Europe. Rats were not the primary vector of Black Death transmission. A 2018 study published in PNAS modeled the spread of the Black Death across multiple European cities and found that the transmission patterns fit human ectoparasites, meaning fleas and body lice living directly on people, far better than they fit rat-borne flea spread. If rats were the primary transmission mechanism, the disease would spread at the pace of rat population movement, which is measurably slower than what the historical record shows. Pneumonic plague, a form that spreads directly through respiratory droplets between people, was almost certainly circulating simultaneously and explains outbreaks in communities with no special exposure to rat populations. The black rat, the species most commonly blamed, was not uniformly distributed across all regions that experienced severe outbreaks, and outbreaks occurred at speeds inconsistent with rat population dynamics in those areas. The bacterium Yersinia pestis is confirmed as the causative agent through ancient DNA analysis of medieval burial sites across Europe, so the what is settled. The how of transmission was more human-centered than the rat narrative suggests. The rat has been absorbing blame for 700 years for a delivery mechanism it may not have needed to be part of at all. 53. Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned. It is the ultimate image of leadership failure. The emperor entertaining himself while his city was destroyed, and it has been used as a cultural shorthand for callous indifference in positions of power for centuries. It appears in historical education as biographical fact. The fiddle did not exist in ancient Rome. Bowed string instruments were not developed until roughly the 10th or 11th century AD. The Great Fire of Rome occurred in 64 AD. That is a gap of approximately 1,000 years between the fire and the invention of the instrument Nero is said to have played during it. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing within living memory of the event, states that Nero was at Antium, modern Anzio, roughly 35 miles from Rome, when the fire broke out and returned to the city to organize relief efforts. Tacitus does mention a rumor that Nero sang about the fall of Troy while watching the fire from a tower, which is the likely kernel from which the story grew, distorted through retelling and transplanted onto an instrument that hadn't been invented yet. Nero opened his own palaces and gardens as refugee camps and organized food supply for displaced Romans, actions that are not consistent with the behavior of a man who was serenading the disaster. The most famous image of bad leadership in history involves an instrument that didn't exist. Someone changed the lyre to a fiddle somewhere in the transmission, and the whole world adopted it. 54. Every science class that wanted to explain what makes humans uniquely special eventually arrived at the same answer. Tools. We make tools. Animals don't. The trait was presented as the bright cognitive line separating human intelligence from everything else in the animal kingdom, and it was used to anchor the entire argument for human exceptionalism in biology education. Tool use has been documented in dozens of species, and the documentation has been thorough and consistent enough for long enough that the claim of human uniqueness on this trait is no longer scientifically tenable. Jane Goodall's 1960 observations of chimpanzees stripping leaves from twigs to extract termites from mounds were disruptive enough that her mentor, Louis Leakey, said they would need to redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans. New Caledonian crows manufacture hooked tools from plant stems, select the appropriate tool for the specific task at hand, and carry preferred tools with them for future use across multiple foraging trips, which demonstrates planning and something resembling tool economy that goes well beyond simple use. Bottlenose dolphins in Shark Bay, Australia, carry marine sponges on their rostra while foraging to protect their snouts from abrasive seafloor, a behavior transmitted culturally from mothers to offspring across generations. The veined octopus collects discarded coconut shell halves, carries them across the seafloor, and reassembles them into portable shelters. Humans kept moving the goalposts every time another species cleared the previous bar. The textbook just stopped updating. 55. The Iron Maiden, the spiked metal cabinet shaped like a human body, anchors the exhibit of every medieval torture museum and appears in educational contexts as physical evidence of medieval European cruelty. It is the artifact that confirms the Dark Ages were genuinely dark, and its dramatic visual impact has made it one of the most recognized symbols of historical brutality. There is no reliable historical evidence that Iron Maidens were actually used as torture devices during the medieval period. Historian Malte Preetzel and other medievalists have searched the contemporaneous documentary record and found no descriptions of Iron Maidens in use as instruments of punishment or interrogation in any medieval court or jurisdiction. Many surviving museum examples appear to be 18th and 19th century constructions assembled from unrelated antique components to satisfy growing public appetite for Gothic drama during the Romantic period. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden, perhaps the most globally famous example, was assembled from unrelated parts in the early 19th century, and its claimed medieval provenance was largely fabricated for the tourist trade. The period of peak Iron Maiden production in workshops aligns precisely with the Gothic revival in European art, when public fascination with medieval darkness created commercial demand for dramatic artifacts, whether or not those artifacts were genuine. History museums have been displaying 19th century theatrical prop work as medieval archaeology for 200 years. The Middle Ages produced enough actual brutality that manufacturing additional evidence seems unnecessary. But here we are. 56. Italian pasta came from China via Marco Polo, who returned from his travels in 1295 carrying the culinary secret that would define one of the world's great food cultures. It is a story of Silk Road cultural exchange that appears in history classes, food documentaries, and Italian restaurant mythology as a tidy and romantic explanation. A Genoese soldier's will, dated 1279, 16 years before Marco Polo returned from China, lists among his documented possessions a basket of macaroni. That is primary source documentary evidence of pasta existing in Italy before Marco Polo came home. The first published connection between Marco Polo and pasta origins appeared in a 1929 issue of the Macaroni Journal, an American trade publication aimed at promoting pasta consumption among American consumers. It was a fictional story, not a historical account sourced from any archive, primary document, or scholarly research. Arab traders introduced dried pasta to Sicily during their occupation of the island between the 9th and 11th centuries, which is centuries before Marco Polo was born, representing a far more historically documented pathway for pasta's arrival in the Italian peninsula. Chinese noodles and Italian pasta are made from different grains using substantially different techniques, suggesting the two traditions evolved independently, rather than one being derived from the other through a 13th century traveler's luggage. The founding origin story of Italian pasta was invented in a 1929 American trade newsletter. Marco Polo had nothing to do with it. 57. Thomas Crapper invented the toilet, and his name became the slang term for it, And this is the most satisfying etymological coincidence in the history of engineering, and the reason elementary school students remember it when they forget everything else from that unit. Crapper was a real person and a genuinely accomplished sanitary engineer who lived from 1836 to 1910. He held 9 patents for various bathroom hardware improvements and ran a successful plumbing business in London. He did not invent the flush toilet. Sir John Harington designed and built a functioning flush toilet for Queen Elizabeth I in 1596 and published the design in a pamphlet that year. That is 240 years before Thomas Crapper was born. Alexander Cummings received the first recorded patent for a flush toilet design in 1775. Joseph Bramah improved the design further in 1778. Both men predate Crapper by nearly a century. Crapper's actual contribution was a reliable ballcock mechanism for cisterns and various refinements to bathroom hardware that improved the practicality of existing toilet designs. He made existing things work better. He did not originate the concept. The word crap appears in English dictionaries in the mid-19th century, predating Crapper's professional prominence, which means his name was unfortunate rather than linguistically generative. His entire historical fame rests on having a funny name while working in the right industry, without being the person who actually invented the thing the industry is named after. 58 fortune cookies are Chinese. They are served at the end of every Chinese restaurant meal in America. They are folded from a distinctly Asian aesthetic template, and their presence on the table signals the completion of a Chinese dining experience so reliably that questioning their origin feels almost culturally impertinent. Fortune cookies were invented in California, almost certainly by Japanese Americans, in the early 20th century, and they are largely unknown as a traditional food item anywhere in China. The leading historical claim attributes the fortune cookie to Makoto Hagiwara, a Japanese American who managed the Japanese tea garden in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, and reportedly served them to guests around 1914. A competing claim credits David Jung, a Chinese-American noodle maker in Los Angeles, who reportedly distributed them around 1918. A San Francisco federal court issued a ceremonial ruling in favor of the Hagiwara claim in 1983, which remains an extraordinary deployment of judicial resources. During World War II, Japanese Americans were forcibly interned by the federal government, and Chinese-American entrepreneurs assumed control of Japanese-owned businesses, including fortune cookie factories, which is the specific historical mechanism by which fortune cookies became associated with Chinese restaurants rather than Japanese ones. When fortune cookies were introduced to China in the 1990s, they were marketed explicitly as American imports. The most emblematically Chinese-American food item is a Japanese-American invention that became Chinese-American after the United States government imprisoned Japanese Americans. That is the actual history. 59 lightning rods attract lightning to buildings, inviting strikes that would not otherwise occur. And installing one is therefore an act of deliberate self-endangerment, dressed up as safety technology. The logic sounds like physics because it connects two real facts. Metal conducts electricity, and lightning is electrical. The connection between those two facts is wrong in the way it matters. Lightning rods do not attract lightning. They provide a controlled, low-resistance path for lightning that would strike the structure anyway, directing the electrical current safely into the ground rather than through the building's walls, wiring, and anyone unfortunate enough to be inside. Lightning seeks the path of least electrical resistance to the ground. A tall building in a relatively open landscape represents a preferred discharge path, regardless of whether any rod is attached to it. The rod does not create the preference. It manages the outcome of the preference. Benjamin Franklin's original design concept, proposed in 1752, was explicitly based on providing a safe discharge path for electricity that would arrive regardless of what you attach to the roof. A properly grounded lightning rod system produces dramatic reductions in structural fires and damage from lightning, which would not be the outcome if the rod were simply generating additional strikes without controlling where they went. The lightning rod does not make your building a better target. Your building was already the best available target. The rod just decided where the electricity goes when the storm arrives, which is all safety engineering ever actually does. 60 school health classes delivered this fact with the authority of settled biology, and it served a clear instructional purpose within anti-drinking education aimed at adolescents who had no framework for evaluating the claim and every institutional reason to accept it. Drinking alcohol destroys brain cells permanently. Each drink eliminates neurons you will never recover. The claim is a simplification significant enough to constitute a misrepresentation of how alcohol actually affects neural tissue, and the misrepresentation matters both for understanding the genuine risks and for understanding how health education selects messaging based on alarm value rather than accuracy. Moderate alcohol consumption does not kill neurons directly. A 1993 study by Roberta Pentney at the University of Buffalo found that alcohol damaged dendritic branching in cerebellar neurons, meaning the connective extensions between cells, without causing significant neuron death at moderate intake levels. The damage is real, and the distinction matters for understanding what recovery looks like. Heavy, chronic alcohol abuse does cause neuron death, primarily through several indirect mechanisms. Most significantly, severe thiamine deficiency, which produces Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome and causes serious permanent neurological damage. Alcohol also suppresses neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, in the hippocampus, affecting memory and learning through a mechanism entirely distinct from killing existing cells. The kills brain cells formulation was a temperance-era simplification that health education adopted because it was alarming enough to be useful and short enough to fit on instructional materials. The accurate version is more complicated. Complicated things are harder to put on posters. 61. The far side of the moon is the dark side of the moon, permanently unlit, cold, and hidden from the sun by the Earth's shadow or by some property of its orbital position. The dark side of the moon is cultural shorthand, an apparent scientific fact, simultaneously, which is a powerful combination for a misconception to have. The far side of the moon receives exactly as much sunlight as the near side over the course of a lunar cycle. Both hemispheres are illuminated for approximately half of every orbit. The moon is tidally locked to Earth, meaning the same face always points toward our planet, but the moon still rotates on its own axis once per orbit, which means both sides cycle through day and night as the orbit progresses. A new moon, from Earth's perspective, is the phase when the near side facing us is in darkness. At that same moment, the far side is fully illuminated by the sun. The far side of the moon has been extensively photographed since the Soviet Luna 3 mission in 1959, which revealed it to be a sunlit landscape half the time, identical in that respect to the near side. The far side is geologically different, with thicker crust and fewer large volcanic plains, but these differences have nothing to do with sunlight exposure. Dark side means hidden from Earth's view, not deprived of solar radiation. The moon is not playing favorites with sunlight. It just doesn't show you the other side, which turns out to be completely ordinary when you actually look at it. 62. Van Gogh cut off his ear. It is the defining act of artistic madness, taught as biographical fact, the moment that crystallizes his mental instability into a single unforgettable image. The complete ear, self-severed and delivered wrapped to a woman at a brothel. Every art history class has this version. Historical and medical evidence strongly indicates Van Gogh cut off only the lower portion of his ear, specifically the earlobe, and not the complete ear as the story consistently implies. Contemporary accounts from the night of the incident, including documentation from the attending physician, describe the wound in terms consistent with the lower portion of the ear rather than a complete amputation. Art historian Bernadette Murphy conducted extensive historical reconstruction from primary sources and found a physician's original sketch indicating the lower portion was removed. The wrapped portion Van Gogh reportedly delivered is described in contemporaneous accounts in terms suggesting a smaller piece of tissue rather than an intact whole ear. Some historians have proposed that a confrontation with Paul Gauguin, who was present in Arles at the time, may have been involved in some way, though Gauguin's own accounts of the period are inconsistent and self-serving in ways that make them unreliable as the sole counter-narrative. Van Gogh's actual biography is dramatic enough without requiring the upgrade from part of the earlobe to the entire ear that happened somewhere between the police report and the art history textbook. 63. The Industrial Revolution gets taught as unambiguous progress in most curricula. Factories, machines, rising productivity, the birth of the modern economy, the technological foundation of contemporary life. The human cost is mentioned in passing, usually as a social problem that reformers eventually addressed, framed as a temporary friction on the way to better outcomes. In Britain, average living standards for working-class people and life expectancy in industrial cities likely declined in the early decades of industrialization before the long-term benefits materialized. Life expectancy at birth in Manchester, England, in the 1840s was approximately 28 years, lower than in contemporary rural areas, and lower than pre-industrial baselines for the working poor. Friedrich Engels documented conditions in Manchester in The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, describing 16-hour working days, child labor beginning at ages 5 or 6, and cholera outbreaks driven by contaminated water in densely packed urban slums. Real wages for many British workers stagnated or fell in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, even as overall national wealth increased, a period economists have named the Engels Pause. Injuries from unguarded industrial machinery were common and largely untreated. Factory workers routinely developed respiratory diseases from textile dust and coal particulates with no legal protections and no recourse. The Industrial Revolution created enormous long-term wealth for some people and killed a great many other people in the short term. Textbooks present the GDP graph and move past the part where children worked in coal mines before they learned to read. 64. Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth, 29,032 feet, the top of the world. It appears in every geography textbook as a settled, simple, singular fact requiring no qualification and admitting no competition. Everest is the highest mountain above sea level. It is not the tallest from base to peak, and it is not the point on Earth's surface farthest from the planet's center. Mauna Kea in Hawaii rises approximately 33,500 feet from its oceanic base to its summit, making it roughly 4,500 feet taller than Everest measured peak to base. The majority of Mauna Kea sits below sea level, so its summit reaches only 13,796 feet above sea level, which is why it doesn't appear on the usual list. By a third measurement, distance from Earth's center, Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador wins. Because Earth bulges at the equator due to its rotation, Chimborazo's summit sits approximately 3,967 miles from Earth's center, roughly a mile farther than Everest's summit. All three answers are technically correct, and each applies a different but physically valid definition of tallness. No textbook clarifies which definition it is using, or that other valid definitions exist. Everest is the highest point above sea level, which is a useful navigational convention. Mauna Kea has been sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, taller than Everest by the most intuitive measurement, while geography classes have been ignoring it for the entire history of geography education. 65. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb in 1879. The clean founding story of electrical illumination and Edison's uncontested place within it is presented as settled invention history in virtually every classroom that covers the industrial age or the history of technology. Edison did not invent the light bulb. He developed a commercially practical and sufficiently durable version of a device that had already been invented, demonstrated publicly, and patented by multiple other people. Humphrey Davy demonstrated electric arc lighting as early as 1802. Warren de la Rue built a working platinum incandescent bulb in 1840. Joseph Swan developed a working carbon filament incandescent bulb and demonstrated it publicly in Newcastle in January 1879, months before Edison's own demonstration later that year. Edison and Swan ended up in patent dispute over the British market and eventually merged their companies there. Swan's house in Gateshead was the first private residence in the world lit by incandescent electric light. Edison's specific contribution was developing a high-resistance carbon filament that burned long enough to be commercially viable, combined with an entire practical electrical distribution system including generators, wiring, and metering infrastructure to deliver power to buildings at scale. That system-level achievement is arguably more significant than the bulb itself and is the actual reason Edison's name dominates the narrative. But Edison built the electrical grid doesn't fit on a classroom poster as cleanly as Edison invented light. So here we are. 66. Viking warriors wore horned helmets. The image is everywhere. Sports teams, Halloween costumes, cartoon characters, tourist merchandise from Oslo to Minnesota. The horned helmet is the universal shorthand for Norse warrior culture, and it appears in educational materials with enough frequency to have acquired the weight of established historical iconography. There is no archaeological evidence that Norse warriors wore horned helmets in battle, none that applies to the Viking Age. The one actual Viking-era combat helmet discovered in good condition, the Geirmundbu helmet found in Norway and dated to the 10th century, is a simple rounded iron cap with a nose guard and no protrusions of any kind. Horned helmets did exist in Scandinavia, but they date to the Bronze Age, roughly 1000 BC, predating the Viking Age by approximately 1,000 years. These earlier horned examples were almost certainly ceremonial objects rather than battlefield equipment. The horned Viking image was created and popularized by 19th century Romantic artists and theatrical costume designers, particularly for Richard Wagner's opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelungs in the 1870s. Wagner's costume designer invented the visual. A helmet with large lateral horns would be a serious practical liability in close-quarters combat. The protrusions could be grabbed, struck, or caught on other equipment to torque the helmet and neck violently. No battlefield warrior designing their own protective gear would choose them. Opera costume designers from the 1870s are responsible for what most people picture when they imagine Viking history. 67. The first Thanksgiving was a peaceful celebration of cross-cultural goodwill between Pilgrims and Wampanoag people who shared a meal in genuine mutual gratitude and harmony. Constructed paper turkeys, smiling figures in buckled hats and feathered headdresses sitting together at a long table. The founding moment of American generosity and cooperation, repeated in elementary school classrooms every November. The 1621 Harvest Feast was a genuine historical event and not a complete fabrication, but it has been mythologized into a founding narrative of peaceful coexistence that strips out the context required to understand what was actually happening and what followed immediately after. The Wampanoag leader Massasoit attended the feast with approximately 90 men, a larger contingent than the entire Pilgrim settlement, and his presence was motivated at least partly by political strategy to maintain a regional alliance against rival indigenous nations, not purely by celebratory sentiment. The Wampanoag people had already survived a devastating epidemic between 1616 and 1619 that killed an estimated 70 to 90% of the New England coastal population, which is a primary reason the land the Pilgrims settled was available and cleared when they arrived. Within 50 years of that 1621 meal, King Philip's War resulted in the near destruction of the Wampanoag Nation in one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in American history. The Thanksgiving holiday as a national institution was formalized by Lincoln in 1863 during the Civil War. The 1621 meal was elevated to founding myth status much later after the subsequent history had already occurred and could be quietly omitted from the elementary school unit. 68. Henry VIII had 6 wives because he was an immoral tyrant with unlimited power and no impulse control, and the 6 marriages are presented in textbooks as evidence of personal depravity so extreme it reshaped the religious landscape of an entire nation. The framing is dramatically incomplete in ways that distort your understanding of why any of it actually happened and what it produced. Henry's marriages were driven primarily by a dynastic crisis of genuine political urgency rather than personal appetite alone. Catherine of Aragon had 6 pregnancies, producing only 1 surviving child, a daughter, and no male heir. In a hereditary monarchy where legitimate male succession was understood as the structural foundation of political stability, this was a governing emergency with geopolitical consequences, not a personal disappointment to be managed privately. The English Reformation, which separated England from Rome and transformed the country's religious, legal, and political identity permanently, was not caused by theological disagreement with Catholic doctrine. It was caused by Henry's need for an annulment that Rome would not grant because of complex European political pressures involving Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The break with Rome was a byproduct of the succession problem. Anne Boleyn was executed on charges that most modern historians consider fabricated, likely orchestrated by political rivals exploiting Henry's succession anxiety as a weapon. Jane Seymour produced Edward VI and ended the immediate crisis. Teaching this as a morality story about personal vice misses the structural reality that the personal and the political were constitutionally the same thing in a hereditary monarchy, and separating them produces a story that is more satisfying and considerably less true. 69. World War I started because Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, and the war followed from that event as effect follows cause. It is presented in virtually every textbook as the clean triggering event, the moment history pivoted, the assassination that explains a world war. The assassination was a spark in a structure specifically built to convert regional crises into continental catastrophes, and the structure is the actual story. The alliance system binding the Triple Entente to the Triple Alliance meant that a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia automatically activated treaty obligations pulling in Russia, then Germany, then France, then Britain in sequence, a cascade that was architecturally predetermined decades before anyone fired a shot in Sarajevo. Germany had developed the Schlieffen Plan, a war strategy requiring rapid Western attack through Belgium before turning east, which once activated made Belgian neutrality militarily irrelevant, and British neutrality practically impossible regardless of diplomatic preference. Imperial competition for colonies, trade routes, and regional influence had generated sustained tension between the major powers for 30 years before the assassination. The July crisis involved dozens of discrete diplomatic decisions by multiple governments over 6 weeks, and different choices at several junctures could have localized the conflict to the Balkans. Blaming World War I on the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is like blaming a house fire on the match, while declining to mention that someone spent 30 years building the house out of compressed explosives and then filled every room with gasoline. 70. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and slavery ended in America. It is presented in history, education as the definitive legal act of abolition, the pivotal document that resolved the central moral crisis of American history, the moment of liberation. The Emancipation Proclamation applied only to enslaved people in Confederate states, currently in active rebellion against the United States government. And since the Confederacy did not recognize Lincoln's legal authority over its territory, its immediate practical enforcement effect in those states was effectively zero. The proclamation explicitly exempted enslaved people in the border states that had not seceded, including Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, states where the federal government actually possessed enforcement authority. It also exempted specific Union-controlled Confederate regions, including parts of Louisiana and Virginia, for similar practical reasons. The document declared freedom in territories where Lincoln had no enforcement power and carved out the territories where he did, which is a political document performing a function different from the one the classroom summary describes. The proclamation had enormous symbolic and strategic significance, particularly in reframing the war explicitly as a conflict over slavery and discouraging European recognition of the Confederacy. That significance is real and historically consequential, but the version that says it freed all enslaved people omits the parts that a civics class specifically exists to teach. Legal abolition of slavery throughout the United States required the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, more than 2 years after the proclamation. 71. You are a visual learner, an auditory learner, or a kinesthetic learner, and if your education had been structured to match your particular modality, you would have performed significantly better and retained more of what you were taught. You may have been formally assessed, assigned a category, and told to advocate for instruction matched to your style. The learning styles hypothesis has been subjected to controlled educational research repeatedly and has consistently failed to produce the specific pattern of results required to validate it. A comprehensive review published in 2008 in Psychological Science in the Public Interest examined the evidence base and concluded the contrast between the framework's enormous popularity in education and the complete absence of credible supporting evidence was, in the researchers' own words, striking and disturbing. The specific experimental pattern required to validate learning styles is called a crossover interaction. Visual learners must genuinely outperform auditory learners under visual instruction, with the advantage reversing under auditory instruction. This pattern is not found in controlled studies. Human comprehension involves multiple cognitive systems operating simultaneously and cannot be cleanly isolated into single-channel modalities. The learning styles industry, including assessments, curricula, teacher training programs, and certification credentials, is estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which creates commercial incentives to maintain belief in the framework regardless of what the research shows. You didn't struggle because your modality was mismatched. The material was genuinely difficult, which is a less marketable explanation. 72. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma believed Hernán Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl when the Spanish arrived in 1519, which is why the Aztecs failed to mount effective resistance to a small force of European invaders. Divine confusion delivered an empire. The story has the narrative elegance of myth, which is appropriate because it is largely a product of myth-making rather than historical documentation. The Quetzalcoatl identification story is disputed by most modern historians and appears to have been substantially shaped or invented in the decades after the conquest, primarily through accounts filtered through Spanish colonial frameworks and the complex political circumstances of post-conquest indigenous testimony. Historian Camilla Townsend's research, published in Fifth Sun in 2019, argues the narrative was constructed after the fact to serve Spanish colonial interests in framing the conquest as divinely ordained and certain indigenous political agendas within the colonial period. Moctezuma's actual documented responses to Cortés's arrival, including deploying significant military forces, attempting to monitor and control Cortés's movements, and managing him through controlled hospitality, are inconsistent with the behavior of a ruler who believed he was welcoming a returning deity with cosmic authority over his kingdom. The factors that actually determined the conquest's outcome include devastating smallpox epidemics, extensive military alliances with indigenous peoples who resented Aztec tributary demands, Spanish weapons and tactical advantages, and deep political fractures within the empire itself. One of those explanations requires understanding what the Aztec Empire actually was. The other fits in a single dramatic sentence, which is why classrooms chose it. 73. Walt Disney arranged to be cryogenically preserved at death, his body suspended in liquid nitrogen beneath Disneyland, awaiting future medical technology capable of revival. It is one of the most persistent celebrity death myths in modern culture, repeated with the comfortable certainty of something that has been verified somewhere by someone, even though no one asking can specify where. Walt Disney was cremated on December 17th, 1966, 2 days after his death from lung cancer. His ashes were interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. His death certificate documents this. His family has confirmed it publicly. The first verified human cryopreservation in recorded history occurred on January 12, 1967, 26 days after Disney's death, which means the technology was not being applied to human subjects at the moment Disney died, and he could not have been the first human frozen, even if his estate had arranged it. The myth appears to have originated in a 1972 publication and propagated through tabloid media before entering general cultural consciousness as established fact. The Cryonics Society of California, the organization that performed the first human preservation, was not operational in the form the myth requires at the relevant time. Walt Disney spent his career constructing the most powerful mythology factory in the history of entertainment, and became the subject of mythology himself within 6 years of his death. He is in Glendale. He is not in a tank beneath a theme park. The Frozen story has no resolution, which would have made it an unusable film pitch. 74. The Great Wall of China is a single, unified structure, one grand engineering achievement expressing the coherent will of Chinese civilization, built to defend against northern threats and visible from space, which you already know from item 3 is also wrong. What you may not have been told is that the Great Wall is not a single wall at all, but a series of multiple walls, fortifications, barriers, and ramparts constructed by different states and dynasties over approximately 2,000 years using different materials, following different routes for different strategic purposes. The earliest wall building efforts date to the 7th century BC during the Warring States period, when individual competing Chinese states built walls primarily against each other. The first emperor Qin Shi Huang connected and extended existing walls around 221 BC, which is the origin of the unified concept, but these early sections were earthen rammed. Earth construction that is largely eroded into the surrounding landscape and is unrecognizable as a wall today. The sections that appear in every photograph, on every postcard, and in every classroom illustration are Ming Dynasty constructions built between 1368 and 1644, more than 1,500 years after the Qin sections, and roughly contemporary with the European Renaissance. The total length of all wall sections across all dynasties is estimated at over 13,000 miles along multiple routes. The singular name conceals 2,000 years of discontinuous construction by dozens of different political entities. Calling it the Great Wall, as though it is one thing built by one people, is like calling every fortification ever built in Europe the castle. 75. Survival of the fittest is Darwin's phrase. Social Darwinism is an extension of Darwin's thought, and the application of evolutionary competition to human social hierarchies is what Darwin's theory logically produces when applied at scale. The phrase is attributed to Darwin. The social philosophy derived from it is treated in history curricula as the intellectual foundation that justified colonialism, eugenics, racial hierarchy, and economic exploitation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with Darwin's name carrying the weight. Survival of the fittest was coined by Herbert Spencer in 1864 in his Principles of Biology, where Spencer applied his own pre-existing social philosophy to evolutionary concepts. Darwin adopted the phrase in the 5th edition of On the Origin of Species, while explicitly crediting Spencer for it. But it was not Darwin's original language, and it was not the framing Darwin preferred for his own theory. Darwin's later work, The Descent of Man, published in 1871, argued explicitly that sympathy, cooperation, and moral sentiment were evolved traits central to human social success, which is the opposite of the competitive social Darwinist framework. Natural selection operates on reproductive success in specific environmental contexts and does not operate on an abstract hierarchy of human superiority that social Darwinism required the theory to endorse. Social Darwinism is to Darwin what the Inquisition is to the teachings of Jesus. People who came afterward took a foundational idea, applied it in ways the originator never endorsed, and permanently attached the originator's name to the result anyway. 76, the ancient Olympic Games established the universal ideal of athletic competition above politics, in which rival states set aside conflict for the pure spirit of sport, creating the noble historical template that the modern Olympics revived and expanded to the entire world. The ancient Olympics were a specifically Greek religious festival from which non-Greeks were categorically excluded by design. Participation required you to be a free Greek man. Women could not compete. Married women were forbidden from attending as spectators at all, under penalty of death according to ancient sources. Enslaved people were barred from participation. The Olympic truce, the Ekekaria, suspended hostilities among Greek city-states to allow safe travel to Olympia during the Games. It did not constitute a general peace, and it applied exclusively to conflicts among Greek polities, with no relevance to wars against non-Greek peoples. The Games were held under the religious authority of Zeus and were explicitly a celebration of Greek ethnic and cultural identity, not a celebration of shared universal humanity. The Pankration, one of the signature Olympic events, was a combined wrestling and striking competition with almost no rules in which choking and joint breaking were both permitted, and deaths during competition occurred without disqualifying the surviving athlete. The spirit of the ancient games, invoked in modern Olympic rhetoric, has been substantially upgraded from its historical reality. The founders of the modern Olympics projected a universal ideal backward onto an ethnically exclusive Greek religious festival, and the history curriculum adopted the projection rather than the history. 77, humans originated somewhere in the Middle East, or in the Mediterranean world, or in the general geography of the civilizations that produced the texts your education was built around, which is not a coincidence in terms of why the misconception exists, but is also not accurate. Anatomically, modern humans originated in Africa. The oldest confirmed fossils of Homo sapiens, found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, are dated to approximately 300,000 years ago. The Omo remains from Ethiopia are dated to approximately 195,000 years ago. Genetic analysis of human mitochondrial DNA traces all living humans back to a common maternal ancestor who lived in Africa approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, a finding that has been replicated across independent research programs using different analytical methods. The Out of Africa model, supported by converging evidence from genetics, the fossil record, and the archaeological record across multiple continents, proposes that anatomically modern humans expanded out of Africa approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago and populated the rest of the world from that dispersal. Some interbreeding with archaic human populations, including Neanderthals and Denisovans outside Africa, is confirmed through ancient DNA analysis and adds complexity without changing the fundamental origin point. Every human being alive on Earth today traces their ancestry back to Africa. This is not contested at the level of scientific consensus. The Middle East is where some humans went after leaving, not where any of them started. 78. Sharks must keep swimming at all times, or they die. Stop moving. Stop breathing. Stop living. The biological rule is stated as absolute and universal, and then used as a metaphor for the consequences of complacency, which should have been your first warning that a scientific claim was being deployed primarily for motivational purposes. The requirement to swim continuously applies only to obligate ram ventilators, a subset of shark species that breathe by forcing water over their gills through the physical act of forward motion. Great white sharks and mako sharks are the most commonly cited examples. Approximately half of all shark species are buccal pumpers, capable of actively drawing water over their gills using muscles in the throat, which allows them to rest stationary on the seafloor for extended periods without any consequence to their respiratory function. Nurse sharks are photographed motionless on the seafloor with such regularity that it constitutes a defining behavioral characteristic of the species. Caribbean reef sharks rest in underwater caves during daylight hours. Even obligate ram ventilators, including great white sharks, have been observed in apparent low-activity resting states near the water's surface rather than continuous active swimming. The myth applies a characteristic of certain shark species to all sharks, which is the biological equivalent of noting that penguins cannot fly and concluding, therefore, that flight is not a bird behavior. The nurse shark is on the seafloor right now, completely motionless, completely alive, completely unconcerned with your classroom poster. 79. The Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower in 1620 were the first Europeans to reach North America. It is the founding arrival in American history education, the beginning of the national story, the moment at which the continent entered the frame of reference your curriculum treats as history. Norse settlers established a confirmed and archaeologically verified settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, around 1000 AD, approximately 620 years before the Mayflower left England. L'Anse aux Meadows was discovered archaeologically in 1960, confirmed through multiple subsequent excavations, and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site based on physical evidence, not legend. The Norse sagas describe expeditions by Leif Erikson and others to a land west of Greenland, and the physical settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows provides material confirmation of actual Norse presence in North America 5 centuries before Columbus reached the Caribbean. St. Augustine in Florida was founded by Spanish colonist Pedro Menendez de Avilés in 1565, 55 years before Plymouth, making it the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. Jamestown, Virginia, was established in 1607, 13 years before Plymouth. The Spanish had been operating continuously in the Caribbean, Mexico, Florida, and the American Southwest for over a century before the Mayflower departed. The Pilgrims were not first. They were the particular group whose arrival became the national founding mythology, which required the curriculum to quietly relocate a confirmed Viking settlement, 2 Spanish colonial establishments, and 13 years of English settlement at Jamestown. 80. Bats are blind. The idiom states it. Popular understanding accepts it, and the biological logic seems to follow directly from everything else you know about bats. They navigate by echolocation. Echolocation compensates for absent vision. Therefore, the vision must be absent. Every bat species has functional eyes and can see. This is true without exception across the entire order Chiroptera. Megabats, the large fruit-eating species commonly called flying foxes, have large and well-developed eyes and rely primarily on vision and smell for navigation and food location. They do not use echolocation in most circumstances. Microbats, the smaller insect-eating species that most people picture when they think of bats, do use echolocation as a primary hunting and navigation tool in low-light conditions, but they also possess functional vision and deploy it actively when light conditions make visual navigation more efficient than echolocation. Research demonstrates that microbat species can switch between visual and echolocation navigation based on available ambient light and task requirements, which is only neurologically possible if both systems are genuinely operational. The idiom blind as a bat appears to have originated from observing bats behaving erratically in direct bright light, which was misinterpreted as evidence of visual impairment. What was actually happening is that echolocation becomes less effective relative to visual noise in high light environments, creating apparent disorientation in an animal whose visual system was not designed for that condition. Bats have possessed functional eyes for tens of millions of years. One colloquial observation became classroom biology through the simple mechanism of repetition without verification. 81. Feed a cold, starve a fever. Ancient folk wisdom transmitted as practical health guidance, present in homes across generations, occasionally appearing in educational health materials as a piece of traditional knowledge with intuitive biological logic behind it. There is no scientific basis for starving a fever. Fever is an active, energy-intensive immune response. Body temperature increase of 1 degree Celsius raises metabolic rate by approximately 10 to 13%. Your immune system is performing significant biochemical work during a fever and requires caloric energy to perform that work. Deliberately withholding food during fever reduces the energy available for immune function at the precise moment your body needs it most. A 2002 study published in Clinical Nutrition found that early nutritional support during illness, including fever, improved outcomes. Starvation during illness is associated with worse recovery trajectories, not better ones. The phrase appears to date to a 1574 English dictionary entry, stating that fasting is a great remedy for fever, which is a medical recommendation from a period that predates germ theory, the discovery of the immune system, and any understanding of metabolic processes by several centuries. The body commonly suppresses appetite during illness, which is a physiological response, not a medical recommendation to actively withhold calories. Starve a fever is a 16th century dietary instruction from a period that also recommended bloodletting as standard medical practice. 2 of those 3 practices are no longer performed. The fever starvation advice survived because it rhymes, which is not a scientific criterion. 82. The Wright brothers made the first powered flight at Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903, and aviation began at that specific moment on that specific sand dune in North Carolina. The story is taught as clean and uncontested founding history. The Wright brothers' Kitty Hawk flight is the most thoroughly documented, sustained, controlled powered flight in the historical record. But first powered flight is a claim complicated by credible earlier challengers whose cases are not taught. Gustav Whitehead, a German immigrant in Connecticut, reportedly made powered flights in August 1901, more than 2 years before Kitty Hawk, with eyewitness accounts published in a local newspaper at the time. Jane's All the World's Aircraft, a respected aviation reference publication, officially credited Whitehead as first in 2013 based on a review of available evidence. New Zealand inventor Richard Pearce reportedly made a powered flight in March 1903, 9 months before Kitty Hawk, though the historical documentation is less complete. The Smithsonian Institution held a contractual agreement with the Wright brothers' estate that required it to describe their aircraft as the first successful powered airplane as a condition of displaying the flyer, an arrangement that arguably constrained the institution's public historical claims for decades. The Wright brothers almost certainly achieved the first documented, reproducible, controlled, powered flight in any meaningful sense. But first in aviation history is genuinely messier than the textbook version, partly because a major museum signed a contract about it, which is not how uncontested history typically requires protecting. 83. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The word salary comes from the Latin for salt. Therefore, the etymology proves the practice, and the practice explains the etymology, and the whole package constitutes one of the most satisfying origin stories in the history of labor compensation. The saltus payment claim is disputed by historians, and the etymology, while real, almost certainly refers to something different from literal salt wages. Roman pay records, the stipendium, document monetary payment in coins across the military record. There are no Roman administrative documents recording salt as a substitute for currency in standard legionary pay. Salt was economically valuable in ancient Rome, but not so scarce or costly that it would have functioned as a practical wage medium for a professional army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers across a vast and logistically complex empire. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder mentions salt in connection with Roman soldiers' compensation, but his phrasing describes an allowance related to salt purchases or salt purchase money rather than literal payment in the commodity itself. The Latin word salarium most likely referred to a salt purchasing allowance added to standard monetary wages, similar in concept to a modern meal stipend, not the replacement of currency with a seasoning. The Romans had coins. They minted them in enormous quantities. They used them to pay soldiers. The salt was a condiment, and occasionally an allowance supplement. It was not a paycheck. The satisfying etymology migrated from allowance for salt to paid in salt through retelling, and nobody checked the pay records. 84. Frankenstein is the monster. Every Halloween costume, every cultural reference, every casual use of the name deploys it to describe the creature assembled from corpse parts and animated by electrical current, and the identification has been so thoroughly embedded in popular culture that correcting it feels pedantic. In Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, Frankenstein is the scientist, Victor Frankenstein, the creator. The creature is never named anywhere in the text. He refers to himself at various points as the atom of Victor's labors, as a wretch, as a monster, but never as Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is the name of the man who made him and then abandoned him, which is a distinction the novel treats as morally significant. The creature in Shelley's novel is articulate, philosophically sophisticated, self-aware, and ultimately sympathetic in ways that make him the most complex figure in the book. He learns language by secretly observing a family through a crack in a wall. He reads Milton. He constructs a coherent philosophical argument for why he deserves compassion. The Boris Karloff film of 1931 established the visual iconography of flathead, neck bolts, and minimal vocabulary that bears almost no resemblance to Shelley's eloquent, self-educated creature. The conflation of monster and creator names is not simply a trivia error. Shelley wrote a novel about the indistinguishability of creator and creation in their capacity for monstrousness. Calling the creature by the creator's name accidentally makes that point while getting the attribution wrong. 85. Prehistoric humans lived brutish, short lives that ended at around 30 to 35 years of age. The average lifespan figure appears in history and biology curricula as evidence of how dramatically modern medicine and sanitation have extended human longevity, framed as the distance between then and now. The average lifespan figure includes catastrophically high infant and child mortality rates that dominate the statistical calculation and are doing almost all of the work in producing the low number. In pre-modern populations, mortality among children under 5 was frequently 30 to 50%. When deaths at age 0, 1, 2, and 3 are included in the average age of death calculation, they pull the mean downward so dramatically that the resulting number bears little relationship to how long adults who survived childhood actually lived. If a prehistoric person survived to age 15, their expected additional lifespan was often 40 to 50 more years, meaning a typical healthy adult in a hunter-gatherer population could expect to live into their mid-50s to mid-60s or beyond. Analysis of Upper Paleolithic skeletal remains identifies individuals who lived well past 50 and some into their 70s across multiple prehistoric populations. Hunter-gatherer male height averaged around 5 feet 9 inches in some prehistoric populations, comparable to modern averages, and in some periods taller than populations in early agricultural societies, where nutritional diversity often declined. Saying prehistoric humans lived to 35 based on average life expectancy is like averaging all American deaths, including infant mortality, and announcing that Americans don't live to retirement age. You are measuring child mortality and calling it adult lifespan. 86. The telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, and his place in the history of telecommunications is as settled as any fact the curriculum offers on the subject. Elisha Gray filed a patent caveat for a telephone design on February 14, 1876, the same day Bell filed his patent application. Bell's application was processed first, by a matter of hours, under circumstances disputed at the time and debated by historians since. Bell received the patent. Antonio Mucci, an Italian inventor, developed a working voice communication device as early as 1854 and filed a patent caveat in 1871, 5 years before Bell's famous filing. Mucci could not afford the $10 annual renewal fee and allowed his caveat to lapse. In 2002, the United States Congress passed a resolution formally recognizing Mucci's contributions to the invention of the telephone, which is the kind of thing Congress does when it acknowledges history got the credit wrong. Bell Telephone Company faced over 600 patent challenges in the decades following 1876, suggesting the invention claim was genuinely and legally contested rather than straightforwardly resolved. Bell himself reportedly never installed a telephone in his home study because he found it an unwelcome intrusion on his work. The inventor of the telephone famously declined to use the telephone. The inventor designation belongs to whoever filed the right paperwork on the right morning, which is how bureaucracies decide history and why history requires occasional revision. 87. Prehistoric humans were short, lived brutish lives, and died around 30 to 35 years of age. The average lifespan figure appears in history and biology curricula as a benchmark for measuring how dramatically modern medicine has extended human longevity, presented as the distance between primitive existence and contemporary life. The number is doing something statistically misleading that the curriculum does not explain. Pre-modern populations experienced catastrophically high infant and child mortality, frequently 30 to 50% mortality among children under 5. When deaths at age 0, 1, 2, and 3 are included in an average age of death calculation, they pull the resulting mean so far downward that the number bears almost no relationship to how long adults who survived childhood actually lived. If a prehistoric person survived to age 15, their expected additional lifespan was often 40 to 50 more years, meaning healthy adults in hunter-gatherer populations routinely lived into their mid-50s and beyond. Analysis of Upper Paleolithic skeletal remains identifies individuals who lived past 50, and some into their 70s, across multiple prehistoric populations on multiple continents. Hunter-gatherer male height averaged around 5 feet 9 inches in some populations, comparable to modern averages, and sometimes exceeding the heights recorded in early agricultural societies, where nutritional diversity frequently declined after the shift to grain-based diets. Measuring child mortality and calling the result adult lifespan is the kind of statistical error that produces a memorable classroom fact and an inaccurate picture of how prehistoric adults actually experience their lives. 88. Sugar makes children hyperactive. Every parent knows it. Every birthday party confirms it, and the observation has been transmitted across generations with the confidence of something verified by pediatric research. The children get the cake, and then they go wild, and the cake is obviously the explanation. Controlled double-blind studies have consistently found no relationship between sugar consumption and hyperactivity in children. A 1995 meta-analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association reviewed 23 controlled trials examining the effect of sugar on children's behavior and cognitive performance, and concluded that sugar does not affect the behavior or cognitive performance of children in the ways the popular belief claims. A landmark double-blind study demonstrated the mechanism of the misconception directly. Mothers who were told their child had consumed sugar when the child had actually consumed a placebo rated their children as significantly more hyperactive than mothers told their children had consumed a placebo when those children had actually consumed sugar. The children's behavior was identical across conditions. The parents' expectations were the variable producing the observed difference. The likely explanation for perceived hyperactivity at sugar-heavy events is the event itself. Birthday parties and Halloween are high-stimulation social environments that generate energetic behavior in children independently of anything they consume. In a double-blind study, the sugar is the control and the parental belief is the active ingredient. The birthday party is doing everything the sugar is getting credit for. 89. The Great Wall of China is one of the oldest structures in the world, an ancient monument of human construction reaching back into the deep past of Chinese civilization. The sections that appear in every photograph, on every postcard, in every classroom illustration, and in every tourist brochure are Ming Dynasty constructions, built between 1368 and 1644 AD. They are approximately 500 to 600 years old, which makes them roughly contemporary with the construction of the Globe Theatre in London and the European Age of Exploration. They are not ancient by any standard applied consistently. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, dated to approximately 9,600 to 8,200 BC, is a complex ritual structure roughly 11,000 years old, predating the Ming wall sections by over 10 millennia. The megalithic temples of Malta date to approximately 3,600 to 2,500 BC. Stonehenge's main construction phase dates to approximately 2,500 BC. The Egyptian pyramids at Giza date to approximately 2,500 BC, roughly 4,000 years before the Ming sections were built. The earlier Qin-era walls from around 221 BC were earthen-rammed earth construction that has largely eroded and is today largely indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. The wall sections on every postcard are younger than the printing press by about a century. They are significant. They are impressive. They are not especially ancient by the standards of human construction, and presenting them as such misrepresents both the wall and the actual age of human architectural achievement. 90. Humans are naturally aggressive and warlike, and this characteristic is a fixed property of the species that explains the persistence of conflict throughout history. The appeal to human nature as the explanation for violence is a claim that sounds like biology while functioning primarily as a conversation-ending rhetorical move that forecloses the structural analysis of why specific conflicts occur. The evidence from anthropology, primatology, and archaeology suggests that large-scale organized warfare is a relatively recent development in human history, associated with the rise of agriculture, the accumulation of surplus resources, population density, and the political structures that emerged to control them, not a universal constant of human nature. Anthropologist Douglas Fry's research across numerous hunter-gatherer societies found that many lack organized warfare entirely. Lethal interpersonal conflict exists across societies, but collective organized military campaigns are far less universal than the naturally warlike framing implies. Archaeological evidence of mass organized violence becomes substantially more common in the Neolithic period with the rise of agriculture and associated social changes. Bonobo chimpanzees share approximately 98.7% of human DNA alongside common chimpanzees, yet resolve conflict primarily through social bonding rather than aggression. The nature equals aggression argument selectively cites our common chimpanzee relatives while ignoring our equally close bonobo relatives, who represent the behavioral alternative that human nature also encompasses. It's just human nature is the argument every institution makes when it wants to present a social outcome as inevitable. The anthropological evidence says, sometimes, under specific conditions. That is a considerably more complicated claim. 91. Computers are faster when their processors have higher gigahertz ratings. More gigahertz means faster computer. It is how processors were marketed for decades and how students were taught to evaluate computing power when making purchasing decisions or studying technology. Clock speed is one of many factors determining computational performance, and in modern processors, it is frequently not the most important one. A processor with lower clock speed but more efficient architecture, more processing cores, or better cache design can dramatically outperform a higher gigahertz chip in real-world tasks. The megahertz myth became an acknowledged problem in the early 2000s when Intel's Pentium 4 chips had very high clock speeds, but were outperformed by AMD Athlon processors with lower clock speeds because the Athlon could complete more instructions per clock cycle. The relationship between clock speed and performance broke down as an industry-wide phenomenon around 2003 to 2004, when processors hit practical thermal and power limits that prevented further clock speed increases. Apple's transition from Intel processors to its own M-series chips beginning in 2020 illustrated this clearly. The M1 chip with lower clock speeds substantially outperformed higher gigahertz Intel chips in both performance benchmarks and energy efficiency due to architectural design differences. Modern processors use multiple cores, specialized processing units, cache hierarchies, branch prediction, and out-of-order execution, all of which affect real-world performance independently of clock speed. Teaching gigahertz as the primary performance metric is like rating a vehicle's capability purely by engine RPM. The number tells you something. It does not tell you what you have been led to believe it tells you. 92. The Sahara Desert has always been a desert, a permanent geographical feature of the African continent, ancient and unchanging, the definitive example of arid landscape that has defined the region since before recorded human history. As recently as 6,000 to 11,000 years ago, the Sahara was a green, humid, and ecologically rich landscape with lakes, rivers, grasslands, and diverse animal populations. This period is documented well enough in the geological and archaeological record that researchers call it the Green Sahara, or the African Humid Period. The transition was driven by changes in Earth's orbital parameters that intensified the African monsoon system, pushing regular rainfall deep into what is now desert. Rock art found at sites across Algeria, Libya, and Chad depicts hippopotamuses, crocodiles, cattle herding, fishing communities, and swimming figures, indicating an ecosystem radically different from the current landscape and a significant human presence sustained by that ecosystem. Lake Megachad, which existed during this period, covered an area larger than the modern Caspian Sea, in what is now the southern Sahara, making it by some estimates the largest lake in human history. The transition from green to desert occurred with relative geological speed, possibly within centuries in some areas, driven by the same orbital precession that ended the enhanced monsoon pattern. Everything humans built in the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean world, the Sahara was grassland and lakes. The permanence of the desert is exactly as permanent as any other landscape configuration the planet decides to rearrange. 93. Julius Caesar was a Roman emperor. The name Caesar became synonymous with emperor across multiple languages, Kaiser in German, Czar in Russian, which seems to confirm his imperial status as the origin point of the title. Julius Caesar was never emperor. He was a Roman general and dictator who was assassinated on March 15th, 44 BC, more than 17 years before the Roman Empire officially began as a governing system. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire in 27 BC when the Senate granted Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, the title Augustus and the extraordinary powers that defined the imperial office. Julius Caesar held the title Dictator Perpetuo, meaning dictator in perpetuity, which was a republican office with a specific constitutional history, not an imperial one. The distinction between republic and empire is constitutionally meaningful, not merely semantic. Caesar's assassination was explicitly motivated by Republican senators' collective fear that he intended to make himself king, a title the Roman political tradition despised, and he was killed specifically to prevent him from consolidating that kind of permanent personal power. He never achieved even the kingship his enemies feared, let alone an imperial office that didn't yet exist. The linguistic connection between Caesar and emperor exists because Augustus and subsequent emperors adopted Caesar as a dynastic title in his honor, meaning the word became associated with imperial power through the people who came after Julius, not through Julius himself. He was so famous that his name became the word for a power he never held, because he was killed before he could get it. 94 All energy ultimately comes from the sun. It is taught as a universal organizing principle of energy chains, a foundational concept that unifies fossil fuels, food, wind, and solar power into a single coherent story, tracing everything back to solar radiation. While solar energy is the origin of most energy humans currently use, the claim breaks down when applied to nuclear energy, geothermal energy, and tidal energy in ways that the curriculum does not address. Nuclear fission releases energy stored in heavy atomic nuclei, including uranium-235 and plutonium-239. These elements were synthesized in supernovae that predated the formation of our solar system. The energy released in nuclear fission is binding energy from stellar nuclear processes occurring in stars that no longer exist, and it has no meaningful connection to our current sun. Geothermal energy has two primary sources: residual heat from Earth's original accretion as a planet, and ongoing heat from radioactive decay of isotopes including uranium, thorium, and potassium-40 in the mantle and crust. Neither source is solar. Tidal energy derives from gravitational interaction between Earth, Moon, and Sun, primarily lunar gravity rather than solar radiation. The all energy comes from the sun principle is a useful simplification for explaining fossil fuels and food chains, which is where it belongs, and it is inaccurate when stated as a universal absolute. The uranium-powering nuclear reactors came from a star that exploded before our sun formed. That is not a solar energy story by any definition. 95, the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799. Scholars read it, and hieroglyphics were decoded, giving the modern world access to ancient Egyptian written records in a moment of archaeological breakthrough that the curriculum presents as clean and relatively swift. Deciphering hieroglyphics after the Rosetta Stone's discovery took 23 years of work by multiple scholars with competing methods and a bitter priority dispute that continued long after the key breakthrough. The Rosetta Stone contains the same priestly decree written in hieroglyphic script, Demotic script, and ancient Greek, which provided the comparative framework for decipherment. Thomas Young, a British polymath, made crucial early progress by approximately 1819, correctly identifying that some hieroglyphic signs were phonetic rather than purely symbolic, and successfully deciphering several royal names, including Ptolemy from the Cartouches. Jean-François Champollion, a French linguist and Egyptologist, built on Young's foundational work and presented his full decipherment framework in September 1822. The credit distribution between Young and Champollion remains a genuine historical debate among scholars. Champollion's decisive advantage was his knowledge of Coptic, the direct descendant of ancient Egyptian still used in Egyptian Christian liturgy, which gave him a living linguistic bridge to the ancient vocabulary that Young lacked. The Rosetta Stone provided the comparative text. It did not translate itself. 23 years of competing scholarship, 2 rival researchers, a living language nobody initially thought to connect to ancient Egypt, and a priority dispute that historians still argue about. The Eureka moment compresses 2 decades of exhausting linguistic detective work into a single scene that is easier to teach than the actual process. 96, the stock market crash of 1929 caused the Great Depression. October 29, Black Tuesday. The market collapsed. The Depression followed. Economic catastrophe as direct cause and effect. It is presented as the foundational lesson of modern economic history. The 1929 crash was a serious disruption and a contributing factor, but economists broadly agree that the Great Depression's severity, duration, and geographic spread were caused primarily by subsequent policy failures rather than by the crash itself. Between 1930 and 1933, approximately 9,000 United States banks failed. This destroyed personal savings across the country, contracted the money supply dramatically, and collapsed consumer spending in ways far more economically damaging than the initial stock market decline. The Federal Reserve, created specifically to prevent banking panics, responded to the unfolding crisis by contracting the money supply and raising interest rates, the precise opposite of what modern economic understanding prescribes for a financial contraction. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's foundational work, A Monetary History of the United States, published in 1963, argues this Federal Reserve policy failure was the central cause of the Depression's severity and duration. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, triggering retaliatory measures from trading partners and collapsing international trade at the worst possible moment. Countries that abandoned the gold standard earlier, like Britain in 1931, recovered measurably faster than those that maintained it. The crash was the accident. The policy responses determined whether it became a recession or a generation-defining catastrophe. Teaching the crash as the cause skips the part where the decisions made afterward mattered more than the event itself. 97. Electricity travels through wires at the speed of light, which is why electrical systems respond essentially instantaneously when you flip a switch. It is implied in basic physics education, covering circuits and the behavior of electrical current. Individual electrons in a wire move extraordinarily slowly, often just fractions of a millimeter per second, through a process called electron drift. In a typical copper wire carrying standard household current, electron drift velocity is approximately 1/10 of a millimeter per second, a speed measurably slower than a garden snail moving at full pace. Individual electrons shuffle through the wire with glacial deliberateness. What propagates at near light speed is not the electrons themselves, but the electromagnetic field disturbance, the signal, which nudges electrons all along the circuit nearly simultaneously from one end to the other. The electrons do not travel from the power source to your light bulb. They shuffle incrementally in place, while the signal moves through them at a fraction of light speed, typically 60 to 80% of light speed in practical conductors. A useful analogy is a pipe already filled with water. Pushing fluid at one end produces immediate flow at the other end, not because the same molecules traveled the length of the pipe, but because the pressure wave propagated through the fluid. Electrons in a wire behave similarly. The electrons in your home wiring will never reach your light bulb. They are the slowest couriers in any physical system, delivering signals that move at nearly the fastest speed the universe permits. The speed of the signal and the speed of the carrier are completely different quantities, and the curriculum has been conflating them. 98. All dinosaurs were massive creatures. The word itself conjures immensity. Towering predators, long-necked titans, animals scaled beyond normal biological reference points. The Jurassic Park frame of reference sets the expectation, and the curriculum reinforces it without significant qualification. The vast majority of dinosaur species were small to medium-sized animals, and many were no larger than the birds you see daily. Microraptor, a four-winged feathered dinosaur from Cretaceous China, was approximately 77 centimeters long and weighed around 1 kilogram, comparable in size to a crow. Compsognathus, one of the most frequently cited small theropods, was approximately 1 meter in total length and weighed under 1 kilogram, roughly the size of a chicken. Of the approximately 1,000 named non-avian dinosaur species in the fossil record, a substantial majority, fall within the size range of modern large birds and mammals. The megafauna, meaning the enormous species, are famous precisely because they are dramatically unusual, not because they are representative of the group's typical body plan. Birds, the living dinosaur lineage, are the most species-rich land vertebrate group with over 10,000 species, almost all of them in the small to medium-size range. In biological terms, dinosaurs as a group are not defined by large body size at all. Every turkey you have eaten at Thanksgiving was a dinosaur. The terrible lizards were mostly not that terrible in terms of physical scale, and the ones that were remarkable for their size are memorable, specifically because they were exceptions. 99, Christopher Columbus died, never knowing he had found a new continent, still believing he had reached the Asian islands he set out to find. It is taught as historical irony about the limits of self-knowledge and the gap between achievement and understanding. The actual historical record is considerably more ambiguous than the clean, dyed, ignorant narrative suggests. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas between 1492 and 1504. By his 3rd voyage in 1498, he encountered the South American mainland at the mouth of the Orinoco River, and wrote in his own journal that so vast a freshwater outflow could only originate from a continent-sized landmass. He referred to this landmass in his writings as Otro Mundo, meaning another world, which demonstrates at minimum an awareness that what he encountered was not simply a collection of Asian island groups. Columbus also maintained the Asia framework in other writings from the same period and continued describing indigenous peoples as Indians and seeking navigable routes to Japan and China. He held both interpretations simultaneously in different documents, which suggests not ignorance, but motivated reasoning from a man with significant financial and political interests in having discovered a valuable Asian route, rather than an inconveniently placed new continent. The continent was named America by cartographer Martin Waldseemüller in 1507 after Amerigo Vespucci, who articulated the new continent argument more clearly and without the conflicting financial incentives. What Columbus believed is less a settled historical fact and more a personality assessment of someone who appears to have known more than he was willing to fully commit to in writing. 100. The Industrial Revolution introduced pollution to the world. Before factories, the environment was clean, balanced, and ecologically pristine. Environmental damage is a modern industrial problem, and the pre-industrial world represents a baseline of natural health against which current damage can be measured. Pre-industrial human activity caused significant and sometimes severe environmental degradation across multiple civilizations, thousands of years before the first factory produced its first output. Ancient Rome had documented lead contamination from widespread use of lead in plumbing, cookware, wine vessels, and construction materials. Ice core samples extracted from Greenland show measurable spikes in atmospheric lead deposits, corresponding to periods of Roman economic expansion, and corresponding drops during periods of plague, economic contraction, and population decline, providing a direct pollution record of Roman industrial activity. Deforestation in ancient Greece, the Levant, and China was extensive enough that Plato wrote in the 4th century BC about the degradation of once forested hillsides in Attica, describing a landscape transformed within living memory. The extinction of megafauna across Australia, beginning approximately 50,000 years ago, and across the Americas, beginning approximately 12,000 years ago, is linked by substantial research to human hunting pressure, rather than climate change alone. Pre-industrial European cities had severe sewage contamination, significant air pollution from wood and coal combustion, and water supplies contaminated enough to drive endemic disease as a permanent condition of urban life. Humans have been degrading environments since populations grew large enough to do so at scale. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the process. It did not originate it. The pristine, pre-industrial world existed only in places where human populations had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers. 101. You are a visual learner, an auditory learner, or a kinesthetic learner, and if the educational system had matched your instruction to your dominant modality, you would have performed significantly better and retained far more of what passed through your classroom. You have probably been told which category you belong to. Teachers built curricula around this framework. School systems invested in assessment tools to sort students into these categories. The learning styles hypothesis has been tested in controlled educational research repeatedly and consistently fails to produce the specific experimental pattern required to validate it. A comprehensive review published in 2008 in Psychological Science in the Public Interest examined the evidence base and concluded the contrast between the framework's enormous popularity within education and the complete absence of credible supporting evidence was, in the researchers' own words, striking and disturbing. The pattern required to validate learning styles is called a crossover interaction. Visual learners must genuinely outperform auditory learners under visual instruction, with the advantage reversing under auditory instruction. Controlled studies do not find this. Human comprehension involves multiple cognitive systems operating simultaneously and cannot be cleanly isolated into single-channel processing modes. The learning styles industry, including assessments, curricula, teacher certification programs, and training materials, is estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, creating powerful commercial incentives to maintain belief in the framework regardless of what controlled research shows. This is the last item in a list of 101 things you were taught with confidence that turned out to be wrong. The question is not which one surprised you most. The question is what you are going to do now with every other thing you were told to simply memorize and accept. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.